Astonishing Legends Network.
Listen to the Astonishing Junk Drawer exclusively at patreon.com/astonishinglegends. A giant up on a mountain range.
I just got stopped by like some CIA agent.
You know there's something right behind you.
What?
Ed, you seem like you have something you want to say.
I don't think you can park there.
So you've been to Point Pleasant.
It's near a Cheesecake Factory. This is all looking up. Men in Black, law enforcement thing.
If he was shooting that on the way up, he would have had to go way out of his way.
CIA or...
I just want to give you an update. I'm not dead.
Well, that's why this is on Patreon.
Legends are still being created right now.
Astonishing Legends would like to thank BetterHelp, Cremo Body Wash, our contributors at patreon.com, and you, our listeners, for making tonight's show possible.
Last week, we sat down for part 1 of the infamous story of Betty and Barney Hill's 1961 UFO encounter and reported abduction. Part 1 was about the story the world owns, and a lot of people who are already familiar with it seem to think they've got it figured out. But tonight, it's time for part 2, Betty and Barney's personal story. We made a point to make sure nearly everything we talked about in part 1 was only from their conscious, waking memories of what happened. We did that because there are 2 other sources of anecdotal evidence in this case that have led to great controversy over the years. Those are the nightmares that Betty had starting 10 days after the encounter, and later details recounted after months of sessions under hypnosis. It's now widely accepted that hypnosis is not a reliable way to recover lost memories. The same can obviously be said for the vagaries of dreams and, more specifically, nightmares. Although, with regard to post-traumatic stress, recurring nightmares related to the inciting trauma can actually be much more accurate than originally thought. The most frightening details of Betty and Barney Hill's encounter are undoubtedly the ones recalled during hypnosis. But outside of the more fictionalized or abbreviated versions of their stories, many researchers have said that not much stock should be put in what was said during their hypnosis sessions. And these are folks who believe their story. We'll definitely be discussing some of what they recalled. Still, we're dedicated to focusing on the evidence that can more readily meet the standards of scientific research and analysis, including physical evidence that can actually be tested and has been. It is in that evidence, which is often fleeting in these cases, that we may get closer to the truth. Tonight, we're honored to have a very special guest to join us, Kathleen Marden. She is not only a researcher, author, and eyewitness to much of the aftermath of the Hills encounter, she is Betty Hill's niece, and arguably the most informed source on the case there is.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
Although Betty and Barney spent 3 years searching for the dirt road where they saw the roadblock and the fiery orb, they did not find the site until Labor Day weekend in 1965. I was with them. Tonight's guest, Kathleen Marden, co-author of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience.
Join us tonight for the final part of our 2-part series on the infamous UFO encounter and abduction of Betty and Barney Hill.
And we're back.
That we are, folks. A very quick announcement. We have some leftover shirts from MonsterFest 2024, so if you couldn't make it there but want to pretend you did, get to our show at astonishinglegends.com, and from the homepage, click on Shop and look under Apparel and Gear for the MonsterFest exclusive shirts. They are a limited edition shirt. We have a finite amount of stock remaining, but some folks at MonsterFest had also asked us for sizes that we didn't have on hand there. So if you're on that list, we're making those available to be hand silk screened and shipped out to you before we retire the screens. But you only get until August 10th, 2024 to place that order. So again, if you want one of our MonsterFest 2024 shirts from this year, get to our store at astonishinglegends.com and either pick one from the remaining inventory we have on hand, or you can pre-order one in sizes that might not have been available. Those can only be ordered up until August 10th, 2024, and they'll ship out after that date.
Yes, and in Astonishing Legends Network news, all 3 of the network shows are wrapping up respective seasons in the next few weeks, so find and subscribe to The Midnight Library, Scared All the Time, and Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf. They are all truly wonderful shows in their own way, yet all astonishingly unique as well, and quite different from our main show.
That they are. Well, we're exceptionally proud of all of them. Everyone is doing such a great job. All right, folks, we have got a great show tonight, so let's dig into it.
So last week, we told you what happened to Betty and Barney Hill from the perspective of our direct shared reality that we all think we're living in together.
Yeah, exactly. Reality itself is a conundrum, isn't
I
it?
suppose.
But when it comes to this case, there's so much to it that if it's a hoax, well, it required a lot of coordination between Betty and Barney, and it may have contributed to his early passing, and it certainly didn't make them wealthy. So I feel like we're not in hoax territory.
Yeah, that seems, as I say, less likely than an alien abduction, which
Yeah,
exactly. I know these are
I'm with you on
ridiculous.
that.
These are ridiculous benchmarks we have to we're subscribing to. But look, people do weird, really, really weird things. Have I said that before? Have I mentioned that? Is that people will go do because they, for whatever reason, they think it's cool, interesting. There is some kind of mental thing happening. Whatever reason, people have done very, very strange things, and they are not indicative of the truth. They are just odd things that people thought, like, let's try this.
Yeah.
Weird
yeah.
hoax. But look at all the hoaxes that have been perpetrated that have been definitely debunked or outed. And this case does not seem to line up too much with that. If you look at the personalities, you look at the evidence purported, the degree and depth to it. Like, as Scott and I always say, it's a long ways to go for a joke.
Yeah, and there's also with this case, and I don't know why it is, and maybe it's because it's been around so long, and it's this first one, it's this Vanguard abduction story. But a lot of folks are just like, oh well, there's a light. There was a light on the mountains, and when you drive on the mountain road, you see this light, or
Right.
they misread a planet or other stars. Which, you know, I don't know how you misread something passing in front of the moon with a pair of binoculars. Or the advertising lights at 11 p.m. in the middle of nowhere, because so many people would haul those out to Franconia Notch, right? And set those up, come to our campsite. What are you going to advertise out there? It doesn't make sense.
All the things you're pointing out here, somebody who really doesn't want to believe that this happened, and that's certainly understandable. None of this matters. That's why it can be really frustrating to either way, get somebody to believe in something you believe in or to not believe in something you think is bunk. On either side, if somebody's really set and like, nope, I totally believe this, not going to budge. It's like, well, look at this, look at that. It didn't make sense. This is illogical. This has been proven false. Or the flip side, it's like, no, I am not going to believe any of this happened. Like, well, what about all the other stuff that happened? The material, the negative press attention, the lifetime of harassment. They're already getting harassed here and there a little bit. All these things that happen, and yet they want to do this, and you're saying like, well, they came out with a story for attention and to make money. It's like, yeah, but there's a lot of other factors going on. The evidence, the torn dress, the scuffed shoes, the dead watches, all that leading. All that in itself could have been faked or gathered together to make up this story. But it doesn't seem to have any logical purpose to have done that for any reason. It's not like they were contestants for a reality show back then. Or to get on TV with the What's My Line or any of the old TV shows. To tell the truth. I know nobody remembers those. And so in this case, though, with Barney and Betty, it's like, well, yeah, they could have both been real kooks. But the other hand, people saying like, well, they just misidentified something. They're decent people. They're well-meaning. They just were really, really tired. They started seeing things. And with that exhaustion, you'd both have to have underlying mental conditions, I think, to hallucinate the same thing or be along the same lines where you both experience this. And you'd have to be up for 3 or 4 days or a week. You know what I'm saying? Maybe then you could be coerced. Or if you were given some hallucinogenic drugs and both hypnotized for days on end, a la MK Ultra, maybe. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. So I guess what I'm saying is that out of all the cases where it's definitely been proved to be a hoax, it doesn't seem to line up with those. With this case, there's just more going on here than the pat explanations of a few things happening.
And that's the other thing that's interesting to me about it too, is that there's a lot of like wildly mundane details in it that are real simplistic sort of, I made this up and I live on Earth stuff. And then there's other really sophisticated things, like the fact that it seemed like Betty experienced an amniocentesis before anybody knew what those were. I mean, they were around, but they were in an experimental stage, being done by like a handful of doctors in remote places. Nobody in the general public had any idea about them. And that's exactly what she described as happening to her, which you're going to hear about that. Now, that's a detail that was recalled under hypnosis. So It's
Yeah,
the
lucky
story
guess.
is so complicated, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot to it, and you can point to many flaws with the telling or the way the evidence was presented or researched, but that's all you're going to get.
All right, well, we're going to be talking to Kathleen Marden in just a little bit, and we just wanted to thank Jim Harold again, the OG podfather, especially of the paranormal, for connecting us with her. He had already interviewed her. If you can find that, I would highly recommend it. But we want to take this opportunity to share a little more background on Betty and Barney and how they met, because we feel like we're getting to the real personal part of this story. And there's important personal experiences or things about their background that everyone should understand so that they can get a bigger picture of who they were. It's not just this stories become, especially these big legends like this, the people get lost in it. This is something we used to talk about back with the Outlaw Pass or whatever. There's always human beings in the middle of the story. So we want to talk about the humanity that's behind this. So when you read Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden's book, Captured, about Betty and Barney Hill, one of the things that they do a good job of doing is telling you a little bit about who they were before they met. And so the first thing to understand is that Betty and Barney had both been married prior. Betty was actually a divorcee who'd been married for 14 years. And just after she had met her first husband, his name was Bob Stewart, she wound up taking custodial care of his 3 biological children that he had from a prior relationship. And I guess his ex-wife had remarried and had twins. And the minute she found out he was remarried, she said, well, here's the first 3, and brought them and dropped them off with Betty and Bob. But she adopted them and started taking care of them. But then she found out that Bob was pretty much a philanderer, and she wound up leaving him.
Right.
Along the way here, and we talked about this a little bit in part 1, for whatever reason, Gulf Oil was interested in the lot her house was on. So she got them to double their initial offer because she's a pretty savvy business person. And she said, all right, you know what? I'll sell you this lot. You guys want it, Gulf Oil. You can pay me twice what you just offered me. And they said, okay. And she was like, oh, all right. And then she was like, what are you going to do with the house? And they said, well, we're going to tear it down. And she goes, I'll give you $1 for it and I'll move it off the lot. And they said, okay. And that makes sense, by the way, because I've had to demolish a house once on a lot, and it's expensive. So for them, that's like, great, take it out of there. That'll save us, I don't know, in 1961, but probably thousands of dollars back then. So she moves the house to another lot, and they have to build a foundation for it and set up utilities. And I think her plan, unless I'm misunderstanding, this was a house that she was hoping to turn into apartments. Because later, I know that Betty and Barney definitely were landlords, but I'm not sure it's the same home, but I think it is. So they move it over to this new lot, she moves it over to this new lot. And while this is happening, she goes and stays at a boarding house because there's nowhere for her to stay. And it's at this boarding house she meets Barney and his first wife, who had come there on a vacation. Yeah. And nothing untoward happened. They were all kind of hanging out, and they were sort of friends. It was very, like very movie-like atmosphere, I guess, where everyone's so they were all just talking and hanging out or whatever. But then a year later, Barney gets divorced, and he starts calling Betty, and they start hanging out. And so let's talk a little bit about Barney here. Yeah. Barney was a high school dropout who enlisted in the Army during a peacetime draft at 18. He was 3 years in the Army. He qualified during that time as a marksman and a truck driver. And while he was in the Army, he had married his first wife, Ruby, and they had 1 son. And I think they had more kids later. But one of the other things that happened to him while he was in the Army, and this will be important later, is that there was an accident with a grenade, and it knocked out some of his teeth, which led to him having dentures at a very young age.
Right, and dentures figures in prominently to, well, let me say this. It's actually one of the times that in the book that's, there is some humor. Betty had a great sense of humor, apparently. Yes, and when she recounted that happening, there's a little interaction with aliens and dentures, and a little comedy ensues. She has a bit of a sense of humor about it, even though it could be also seen as part of the terrifying experience. But anyway, if you have heard that Barney's dentures were examined, that's why he had dentures. I never knew that before.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So folks might not have known that that was because of an accident while he was in the Army. But everyone said that he was a great father. He was a loving father to be around. He actually was involved with the Boy Scouts in a part of troop, I think it was 133 in Philadelphia in 1957. But not too long after him and Betty started hitting things off, I guess they spent 10 months apart due to work. And they didn't get a chance to really get together because he was living in Philadelphia and she was in Portsmouth. So the first time they had met that we were talking about earlier, when he was vacationing with his first wife, that was 1956. And after that, they started communicating a lot more. And then Betty took Barney to meet her family, and her family loved him because guess what? They were all very politically active. They were very much involved in politics and civil rights and social causes and that sort of thing. And so was Barney, and that was something they really liked about him, except for a few, quote, racially prejudiced individuals in her family, which everybody's family has those. That's taken from page 24 of Captured the Book. So Betty's a social worker. Barney is a city carrier at the U.S. Post Office in Philadelphia, and then he gets transferred to Boston. We mentioned this in part 1, which would then give him just a 60-mile commute from Betty's house, as opposed to the 5 or 6 hour drive when they from Philly to Betty's house. Kathleen, or Kathy, who is their niece, who is the co-author of the book, thinks Barney liked to be with kids to ease the pain of not being around his biological sons in Philadelphia once he moved back to the further to the east. So Betty's house is finished, and it now has tenants in them. Their tenants are folks that they get super friendly with. They're all getting along. They hang out a lot. They cook out together. It's Dot and Henry in one of the apartments with 3 kids, and then Jean and Bill in another apartment with 2 kids. So Henry and Bill, the 2 men there, are both stationed at Pease Air Force Base, which is now an Air National Guard base.
Right.
The kids all played together. It sounds like a pretty idyllic situation, frankly. But one of the things that we mentioned in part 1, and we're going to talk a little bit more about tonight, is the fact that Barney and Betty are an interracial couple. He's black, she's white. So they're dealing with racial inequality. And that's part of something he always had to deal with. There's an allusion to the fact that he was pulled over frequently in Portsmouth in New Hampshire once he moved there. And that undercurrent, of course, it seems to contribute to Barney's anxiety, or at least that's what seems to be implied. So the reason we're going to talk about this backstory a little bit is because we're going to be talking to Kathleen about some of these memories that he's recovered and the ideas that the memories are rooted in some of his generalized anxiety, because that is something that a lot of people who are skeptical of the story will say. They say, oh, well, these aliens are stand-ins for Nazis or racial oppression. And so before you go down that road, you need to understand a little bit about where they're coming from. Now, in 1961, interracial marriage was still illegal in 21 states. That's Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Utah. Illegal in all of those states.
Well, I liked how you alphabetized those and did not say South Carolina right after saying North Carolina. You didn't keep your Carolinas together. Well,
I know I did. Well, they're not alphabetical.
I know, that's why I'm applauding you, sir.
Yeah.
Very meticulous of you. But in New England, and states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the states further north, including Betty and Barney's home state of New Hampshire, there were no laws against interracial marriage at that time. And in fact, New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, New Jersey never had any laws against it. Pennsylvania, in particular, had a ban for a time, but then it repealed its anti-miscegenation laws in 1780. And so as Barney and Betty, they took their honeymoon trip, they traveled through states where their marriage was actually legally recognized. But there was still plenty of reason to be nervous about racial prejudice. So, you've seen the Green Book. There's people were aware of this. If you had to live it, you were very much aware of this. It was talked about in your circles. You knew about it.
Yes.
No, it was a very real thing. It's a very worldwide thing. And that's just part of American history at that time in the early 60s.
And part of the reason Barney brought Betty's pistol on the trip was because during his first marriage, he had to sleep on the side of the road with his first wife on a trip to Detroit after getting too tired to keep going. And he wished he'd had protection that time. So remember, he was a marksman in the Army and he knew his way around weapons. But, they also went into Canada. Canada never had anti-miscegenation laws like the United States. Interracial marriage was never illegal at the federal or provincial level in Canada. There were marriages between European settlers and indigenous people there, and that was going on from early on. But those relationships still faced social prejudice, but they weren't illegal.
Well, that's also what's odd is, of course, in pioneer old-timey days, there were a lot of white European settlers who married indigenous women here because there weren't a lot of women out there on the frontier. Right. And so that happened, but you did a different way of handling it and in a different time and a different place. But that's what you end up with, again, from the late 50s into 1961 when they had their experience. And so, that's something they've been dealing with. Well, Canada still, though, had some issues with racial prejudice.
Yeah, particularly in its immigration policies. Certain non-European immigrants faced restrictions and discrimination,
Yep.
which, of course, that has an effect on interracial relationships, but there were no laws against the marriages themselves.
Yeah, so there was definitely racial prejudice and resistance to interracial marriage, but these weren't backed by laws. So Canada allowed interracial marriages to happen without legal issues, but that didn't necessarily change people's opinions about it.
That's right. But ultimately, Betty and Barney had reason to be slightly more at ease there from a legal standpoint. And all this background gives you a little more insight into not only who Betty and Barney were as people, but also the times they were living in.
And both were very active, but Barney especially was very active in civil rights activism. They were members of a Unitarian church in Boston, and they both participated in working with the NAACP. He was a legal redress officer with them, and meaning he advised them on discrimination lawsuits. He was also in the Governor's Council of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission and was a board director on the Rockingham County Community Action Program, which he and Betty co-founded. And all of this while still working full-time for the U.S. Postal Service. So you can see that they were very much impassioned about their causes.
Now, the Unitarian Universalist Church, or UUA, was formed in 1961 when the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America merged. Now, 61 was the date of their encounter, so they were likely already involved in one of those branches before that merger. Now, both of those groups have roots in Christianity, but they've taken a different path.
Right. And what stands out about them is they don't have a fixed set of beliefs.
Exactly. You know, from our research, which includes the UUA official website and Britannica, they support a pluralistic approach to spirituality and religion. Members might draw from Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, humanism, and more.
Right. And they also have the 7 principles they follow, right?
That's right. The principles include the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, compassion, and a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Plus, they respect the interdependent web of all existence.
No, I don't buy any of that. I reject all of that. Just kidding here, of course. Well, their services can be pretty diverse too, right?
Yeah. Their worship can include readings and rituals from various religious traditions, as well as contemporary and humanist sources. They focus a lot on community, social justice, and personal spiritual growth.
So that's all a big part of who they are.
Yes, and on top of that, even though Unitarian Universalism has roots all over the world, its first official acceptance in the U.S. was in Boston, back in 1785 at King's Chapel, which is actually now on the National Register of Historic Places. Beautiful, beautiful building.
Unitarian Universalism's foothold in the United States was essentially in New England, and more specifically Boston, where Barney worked for the Postal Service. And that's just 60 miles south of Portsmouth, where he and Betty lived.
Yeah, and we think their church was probably South Church in Portsmouth, but we can ask Kathleen about that in a little bit. Either way, this tells you a little bit more about the kind of people Betty and Barney were when this UFO story changed their lives forever. So let's come back a little bit to what their plan was for their trip. And this is just going to be a brief reminder of what we already talked about in part 1. First of all, they wanted to do the whole trip for like $70 or less. They were going to eat cheap. They brought food to prepare on the road, no fancy hotels. There was a cooler. And then again, Barney had the pistol in case they were sleeping in the car. And of course, Delcy, the dachshund, who got to ride along with
the killer
him.
Dachshund, yes.
Recapping some of the basic points about the report, let's just use the report that they made to Pease Air Force Base as a framework for this. They were driving along. Betty sees this craft outside the window. It was described as the size of a nickel at arm's length initially. Then it got closer, the size of a dinner plate at arm's length, which is pretty huge, folks, if you hold up a dinner plate at the end of your arm. And it came down to where it was hundreds of feet above them. It was first seen through the windshield.
It was seen through the windshield and took up the entire width of the windshield in their view. Yeah.
Right. That's pretty scary. You can see, by the way, that all the influences in Close Encounters, like, that Spielberg took from this encounter. There's a lot of heavy stuff happening here. It had wings that came out that appeared to make kind of a V shape, extending further as the encounter went on. They had red lights on their tips. There was no tail, no trail, no exhaust, no sound. Barney and Betty saw it both with binoculars and the naked eye. They saw it from the car while it was moving and stopped from inside and outside the car. So just think about that, folks. Think about they're confused. It's a light in the mountains. It's like, okay, They saw it while they're riding in the car, but it wasn't just that. There's plenty of famous cases where, I saw it, we were driving along, and they were in the car the whole time. No, they saw it there. They saw it when they stopped the car. They saw it when they got out of the car, and then they also saw it while they were out of the car with binoculars, and they both used the binoculars to look right at it. It's hard to see, and those are not hypnosis regression memories. That's memories of what the encounter was like for them. They described it in the report, at least, as moving north very fast, then suddenly moving south, then hovering, and while hovering, that's when the wings came out. Then it swooped down toward them. At that point, they fled in the car, and Betty was unable to see the final departure while Barney was driving because they were in the car now. They do mention that buzzing sound in the report, but they don't mention the missing time. So now we're going to talk about what might have happened during that missing time, both in the context of Betty's nightmares and then in the context of their hypnosis. And then we're going to welcome our guest, Kathleen Marden, to get more into the weeds on it. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. And do you ever wish you were living someone else's life?
Not really. I mean, I guess maybe if I had fewer challenges or things were simpler. But then maybe they'd be less interesting. Not that my life is all that interesting. But I'll tell you one thing that I am doing lately, though, is driving by other people's houses and comparing my upkeep or landscaping to theirs, or wondering if they have less clutter, and maybe being a little envious of that. But you know what they say, comparison is the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives.
You know what? That's a great quote, and I believe it's true. And we all know what happens a lot on social media these days. You see all these folks looking like they're leading fabulous lives in beautiful, exotic locations, going on glamorous trips, fancy restaurants, getting VIP treatment, blah, blah, blah. But I'd bet dollars to donuts that isn't really the reality. I know that for a fact because there's a couple of those places where you can pretend you're in an airplane in a strip mall near here. So, but look, it looks like they've got it all going on in their feed, but they're probably just bumbling around like the rest of us. Yeah. So what do you do when you get caught up wishing your life looked like someone else's?
Wow. Well, that's kind of a Zen question, but I'd say first, you need to remember that you have more going for you than you realize, and the power to make your life what you want it to be is within you. Yeah, I know, Zen answer, but I happen to think it's true. And secondly, as I always say, one of the hardest things to do is figure out what you really want in life. And I don't mean you want shots of you on vacation in Amalfi to post. I mean long-term goals. But I also know figuring out what you really want can be a daunting task, and knowing how to go about it seems beyond your ability.
And that's where therapy can help. It can help you figure out what's going on with you and find the answers that are already within you. And therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. And if you have circumstances or trauma holding you back, it can be helpful for learning positive coping skills. But you don't need to have experienced trauma. Maybe you just need a little push and some fresh, objective viewpoints.
Yep. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try.
It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule.
Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge.
Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp.
Visit betterhelp.com/astonishing today to get 10% off your first month.
That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/astonishing. Well, is it hot enough for you?
Yeah, it's hot enough. We get it. It doesn't need to be any hotter. Thank you.
Well, what do you do to keep cool in this heat wave, man?
Well, without central AC, it gets pretty miserable and there ain't much you can do. But one thing that works for me, like it did last night, is a nice, cold, or at least cool shower, especially right before bed. And the icing on that cake, which helps me get to sleep with sweet dreams, is using Cremo's men's body wash. And we weren't kidding before when we said it's like aromatherapy. Cremo ain't making your run-of-the-mill sporty scent.
No, it is not, especially their new bourbon vanilla body wash, which, as you say, invigorates the senses and soothes. And it's masterfully crafted with bold distiller spices, perfectly blended with notes of rich Madagascar vanilla and aged oak that creates a shower experience for those with discriminating tastes.
Yum. Well, it does make a regular shower feel like a luxury experience, but in this weather, I'm aiming for a relaxing, calming experience to help me get to sleep. Elevating my hygiene routine with a rich, lathering, hydrating formula that delivers balanced, multi-layered fragrances is just a bonus. But what makes Cremo different from other men's body washes, and what do we mean by distinct, layered scents that evolve as you wash? Well, for example, another Cremo scent I've come to love is their Bergamot Black, with scent notes of bergamot, geranium, and patchouli. But I was intrigued by how Cremo would handle this, so I got some, and I was delighted because nothing was overpowering and the scents were naturally complementary. It really does seem to develop and blend as you wash and after, like the flavors from a master chef's dish. And the clean, fresh feeling and scent are long-lasting for a superior shower experience, and that's why I love Cremo. It's clever.
Yeah, Cremo is like nothing you've ever used before because they work with master perfumers to make sure that every Cremo body wash scent is meticulously blended and refined. And every wash I've tried smells like a high-end cologne, but yeah, I'm not overpowering because we're not really cologne guys. Anyway, you've sold me, man. I'm going to try all the Cremo scents.
Excellent, my good man. They're all worth trying out. Well, we know you'll love Cremo Men's Body Wash too, and you'll also love their wide range of other grooming products for men, including shave cream, beard oil, and shampoo, all in a variety of distinct masculine scents.
You can find Cremo Men's Body Wash and its new distinctive bourbon vanilla scent at Walmart or Walmart.com.
Once again, that's at Walmart or Walmart.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ben James, and this is Astonishing Legends. Let's get back to the show.
I'm sure Kathleen's going to talk about this a little bit, but we have to address Betty's nightmares. These are dreams that she started having about 10 days after the initial event. She only had 5 of them, and it's a major point of interest in this case. So we're not going to go into the actual, dreams, recounting each dream. We're just going to talk about some of the frightening details that came from the dreams that overlap with things that were recovered in hypnosis. It's important to remember that these dreams for her were had out of order chronologically, and she took notes on them and wound up putting them into the order that she thought things happened. One of the crazy things that she remembered that's really frightening from one of her nightmares was being taken onto a landed disc for experiments that included nail clippings, skin scrapings, earwax, and hair samples collected on some kind of slides right in front of her. The other shocking thing she recalled was a procedure to determine whether or not she might be pregnant. At least that's what she thought it was. A 4 to 6 inch needle was inserted into her navel. Now, Forrest mentioned this procedure in part 1 as something that caused her a lot of pain until the leader on the craft noticed she was hurting and waved his hand in front of her eyes, at which point the pain vanished. That procedure that Betty described from those nightmares is known as amniocentesis, and it's now done regularly. But in 1961, it was a little-known experimental procedure. She described something that was unknown to her and the wider medical community at the time.
Well, in another dream or nightmare, depending on your point of view, and which I think are interesting because they add so much to the story, whether you discount them or not. I think it's some part of, as it said in the book, her reality.
Yes.
Of what happened. Whether it's objective reality, that's to be determined. But in one dream, beings came in to the room that she was in, the exam room, and in a way that she could not understand, they seemed to indicate that something had gone wrong. They were puzzled by something. So then the examiner fellow comes back into the room and he reaches in, he starts checking her teeth, like kind of tugging at them to see kind of if they were firmly in place or if they came out somehow. And then she kind of realized in this moment that they must have removed Barney's dentures, and they wanted to know if her teeth came out in a similar way, that they were puzzled, like, do all humans have removable teeth? Why do they do this? Why aren't they born with them? Well, as we learn later, he had dentures because of an accident with a grenade when he was in the Army. So it damaged his teeth and had to have dentures. But what was funny in the book was that she kind of chuckled at this because they seem so very puzzled by it. Like, to us, it's like, well, yeah, if you lose your teeth, I mean, shouldn't this be known to you? Like, if you lose your teeth, we're going to have artificial ones made.
Technology and understanding, and but
could they be that clueless? But to us, that's simple, and we do the reverse thing. To them, I'm sure there are concepts that they think that we should understand, but we don't.
Well, no, it's like when you catch one of those little lizards and their tail falls off and they just run away. It's like, well, wait, what? Can you do that? Does it grow back?
Yeah, exactly, I suppose. Well, in one of her dreams, she asked this leader, another character, apart from the examiner, I believe, who was much more friendly with her and interacted and communicated with her. She could take proof from their ship with her. And then the leader says, well, okay, sure. And so she finds a book. Again, I'm fascinated. Like, they have books, I guess.
Yeah, they have books.
Not just screens as we do. She picks up some kind of reference manual, and it was filled with symbols that she couldn't read herself. but he seemed to open it. And then another crew member or some other members, they got angry that she had taken it. I think it was especially this one character who was he was kind of grumpy.
Yeah.
He's kind of like, no, we need that. You're not giving her the operations manual for this ship or whatever it was. So then the leader apologized, saying he'd been overruled about it because it had been decided that they were not allowed to remember their experience here. And so I understand that as well, that if they're going to go through all that trouble to make them forget, you're certainly not going to let them go home with a book.
Or they bring it home and they go to all the trouble to decipher it. It takes 15 people 12 years to decipher it, and it just says, "Do not start going down the ramp until the ship has come to a complete stop."
It just, who knows? And it could have been something like a futuristic alien Voynich manuscript, but we'll never know now. So again, another foiled attempt at bringing back some hard evidence with her, but I can understand both positions where, the leader said like, well, they're not going to understand her to read it anyway. They'll just think she's a kook.
Yeah.
Anyway, but there's also a star map. And so at another point, she asked the leader, hey, where are we? Where are you from? And he was surprised. Well, he asked her first, I believe, like, do you know anything about the universe? And she said, well, no. And he kind of chuckled, I guess. Or
he laughed at her. There was sarcasm, which is like, oh, so they have human emotions? Do they? Yeah,
if there was humor there, that is it. I found that interesting, is that they're not the automaton cold robots that some of them may be. That furthers our information about them, but at least this leader type, maybe the captain, had a little bit more of a sense of humor, and there was some snarkiness there because she asked, well, where are you from? He says, well, what do you know about the universe, or what do you know about our position? She says, well, I don't know. He says, well, then I can't really give you a reference, so it's not going to do me any good to tell you where we're from.
Right.
And so I found that kind of curious. But then he pulls down some kind of a map that comes out of the wall. And this is interesting because I believe it was Stanton Friedman in the book who says, well, this could be akin to what she's used to knowing about any geography class. You pull down the map from the, goes in front of the blackboard. Yeah, it goes in front of the blackboard.
By the way, I don't know if Gen Z or millennials or Gen Z ever had those in their classrooms unless they went to a pretty old school. When I went to high school, even in the 80s, they were still in there. They were were like maps from the 70s and sometimes the 60s, but it was like a blind that you just pull down and
that's my point, though. Somebody who was a kid now being abducted, would they understand that, or would he pull out a map that was like a clear piece of acetate that just out from the wall, like that kind of modern version? Well, that's what she saw, according to her dream, that he pulled out this map. It was, like a classroom from the 50s or 60s that she would understand, but she still remembered what it looked like and what was on it. And she noted that there were lights of varying size on it, that it must have corresponded somehow to the density or size maybe of the star cluster where they were from, their home planet. And then they seem to have lines connecting them, some dotted, some solid. I believe the leader also said the dotted lines those are proposed exploration routes. The other ones were solid, like maybe trade routes or just known pathways.
Yeah.
I think in a later dream or later recollection, she said maybe it was more something with a screen that you could lean into, and there are different layers. Like some layers had stars in them, some layers had other information, like the lines, and it was like more like a large TV
like that
box
thing of the Death Star that they could walk around. And it was 3-dimensional.
Right. So that was all very curious about how she perceived it in the moment, in the dream, and also consciously in the moment as a dream, and what was retrieved as a hypnotic regression episode.
And here's the last thing that's interesting about these nightmare dreams, or dreams that are connected to post-traumatic stress. According to Friedman and Marden's book, Captured, those kinds of dreams can actually be exact or close to exact memories of a traumatic event. It's different from your sort of standard, REM state dream where everything is like, as I think I heard a Radio Lab once where they said the later into the REM state you get, it's like a DJ mixing up all different genres of music. That's when your dreams go really haywire. But they were saying that specifically in this case, with traumatic dreams, it might be a pretty accurate representation of what happened to you. There's one other thing I want to mention. I think I mentioned in part one, Walter Webb, who did one of the reports, or 2 reports on the case, actually, that are really good and thorough. And we were talking about how he was connected to the Hayden Planetarium. And I was like, oh, yeah, New York, Neil deGrasse Tyson. But it's not that one. It's the one in Boston. So that's a correction. I just wanted to let folks know. We're making a correction to part 1. Send your emails to Forrest about the mistake that I made.
Scott gets those anyway. But
yeah, I get them anyway.
First.
And I also wanted to mention something about the binoculars, because today when I was doing some research, I was like, I want to know a little bit more about these 7x50 binoculars and what that means. So I went to this website called Binoculars Guru, and I wanted to share this with folks real quick. Situations where 7x50 binoculars would be appropriate. 1, marine activities. Due to their ability to offer a stable image, 7x50 binoculars are perfect for marine activities such as boating, sailing, and fishing. They allow the user to scan the horizon and view objects that are far away with great clarity and detail, including distant landmasses, markers, and buoys. It also says it's good for nature observation for the same reasons, and they're good in low light conditions. So I just thought that was interesting. That's a magnification of 7. 50 is the diameter of the lens. So that's a 7x magnification. So just remember that when Barney and Betty were using the binoculars looking at the craft, they were seeing a 7x magnification there. All right, so it's time to move on to the hypnosis portion of this conversation.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about hypnosis. But before we recount these details, we want to read something that Kathleen Marden wrote to us in one of her emails, with her permission, of course.
I have to point out that this corrects another error I made in part 1 about the time on her watch, on Betty's watch. Kathleen points out that Betty reset the watch to the time in her house. So that was the 5:16 time, presumably AM. It never ran again, so it just stayed there in 5:16. We can't be sure what time it said when it stopped working. She probably just was like, oh, this isn't right, and she reset it, thinking it would come back to life, but it didn't. So in the meantime, before we recount anything from Betty and Barney's hypnosis sessions, we wanted to qualify it with Kathleen's opinion on using the hypnosis details as factual evidence. Forrest, would you mind reading this passage from Kathleen's first email to us?
As a retired hypnotherapist and quantum healing hypnosis technique practitioner and scholar on hypnosis, I know that hypnosis is valued for its therapeutic use. It can be highly successful in assisting victims of trauma or anxiety in recovering. EMDR therapy and guided imagery can as well. But it is not a highly valuable tool in establishing factual information. It is no longer admissible in a court of law, so it should not be considered as highly valuable evidence. The investigative value of hypnosis in the Hill case is that Dr. Simon hypnotized the Hills separately and reinstated amnesia after each session. He did this for 2 reasons. 1, to ascertain that their individual memories could not be shared and lead to contamination from one to the other. And 2, sometimes their emotional reactions were so severe that an immediate memory of the emotionally charged event would induce additional trauma. During the last 2 of their 6 months of hypnosis and therapy, Dr. Simon saw Betty and Barney together and played and discussed their hypnosis tapes. Now, for the first time, they heard what the other had recalled through hypnosis. It was a long, successful therapeutic process. As the legal representative for the Hills and the major investigator of their case, I conducted a comparative analysis of their separate statements to Dr. Simon as opposed to Betty's hypnopompic dream memories that occurred days after their UFO encounter. Betty documented her dreams, so it gave me the opportunity to transcribe all their statements during 10 hours of hypnosis sessions and conduct a comparative analysis of their separate statements. As you probably know, the Hills remembered, without hypnosis, everything that occurred up to the series of code-like buzzing tones that struck the trunk of their 1957 Chevy Bel Air. It is documented in the United States Air Force Air Intelligence Information Report 100-1-61, in Betty's letter to NICAP, in Walter Webb's confidential NICAP reports, and in award-winning journalist John Luttrell's investigation. He located witnesses to the craft on the night of the Hills encounter. Parts of John Fuller's book are inaccurate, so we should not pay too much attention to his book, nor the movie based on his book, as it is more inaccurate than the book itself. The tones caused their vehicle to vibrate and a tingling sensation to be felt in their bodies. Almost immediately, their recall became vague until the second series of buzzing tones restored them to full consciousness, 30 to 35 miles south of the close encounter field. The following day, they discovered shiny concentric circles on the car's trunk that had not been there the previous day, and a compass revealed a magnetic field around the shiny spots. My family and I saw the spots a couple of days after the Hills event occurred. Betty phoned my mother on the afternoon of September 20th, 1961, hours after they arrived home, and I overheard their conversation. When she and Barney arrived home, Betty realized that her watch was no longer running, so she set it by the clock inside her house. I have her watch, and it reads 5:16. It was broken and never ran again. Given the short observational stops, the miles traveled, and the rate of speed, she and Barney should have arrived home between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Therefore, they could not account for approximately 2 hours. But they had the vague memories of finding themselves on a dirt road lined with tall trees, a roadblock, and a fiery orb that appeared to be sitting on the ground. They searched for this spot for years before they finally located it.
Just quickly, I want to add to this that when Forrest mentioned in that passage the Air Intelligence Information Report 100-161, the Betty's letter to NICAP, Walter Webb's NICAP reports, and the other stuff, a lot of that Kathleen Marden has already shared with us, and you can find on the website for these 2 episodes.
It was Kathleen who helped Betty and Barney find the spot where they believed they were taken, and it was sometime later. Also, I want to say John Fuller, we might not have mentioned him a lot. He wrote a book called The Interrupted Journey, which we did not refer to a lot for this because it was our understanding that it was a little bit of an amalgamation of details and things. It might have, it's not a bad book, but the captured was the more accurate one to read from. So that's why Kathleen is referring to John Fuller as an author in this passage. So framing this section about the hypnosis, we do need to talk about Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was the one who conducted these sessions. Betty and Barney were referred to him as a local, highly talented hypnotherapist. He is a Stanford grad and also graduated from Washington University School of Medicine. His name, again, is Dr. Benjamin Simon. He taught at both Harvard and Yale as well. Additionally, he was trained in New York on the medical use of hypnosis. He served in World War II in the Army and treated soldiers returning from combat for what we now know as PTSD. He was skilled in deep trance hypnotherapy, and John Huston even made a documentary about him called Let There Be Light. He was also skeptical about UFOs, but wanted to help Betty and Barney from a clinical standpoint. So let's get into the details from the hypnosis stories that we haven't been able to share yet. I want to quote a couple of sentences from Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden's book, Captured, about Dr. Simon's approach to this. He made it clear to them that hypnosis is not a magic bullet or necessarily a pathway to the objective truth. Rather, it is the truth as the subject perceives it and may or may not be consistent with objective reality. So it's important to note that both Betty and Barney were good subjects. They were good hypnotic subjects. And as a result, Dr. Simon did not use narcosynthesis, meaning there were no drugs used to induce the hypnotic state. Now, some people are not good at being hypnotized, but Betty and Barney were. And the book goes on to point out, if I remember correctly, people that are good at being hypnotized, it doesn't imply that they're gullible or easy to trick or that they want to be hypnotized. It's just that about 80% of the population isn't great at it, but 20% is suited for it, and Betty and Barney both were. Now, Dr. Simon also worked to make sure that they went to what's called the somnambulistic state, so he could impose post-hypnotic amnesia on them to prevent Betty and Barney from talking about whatever they recovered in their separate sessions. It was believed that they had traumatic amnesia or dissociative amnesia already, a kind of memory loss that protects individuals from things that may have overwhelmed them. And this could be the reason for the missing time from that night. The theory is that whatever happened to the Hills that night, they lost a few hours, and that kind of amnesia could be why they lost it, or there may be more complex reasons. But that lost time was framed by the buzzing sounds that they heard in the car, where they kind of lost track of where they were, and suddenly they were driving down the road 30 miles away from where they'd been. Listen again to this passage from Friedman and Marden's book. The use of hypnosis to recover repressed memory has engendered more controversy than any other issue related to hypnosis. Cognitive science has established that most people are able to discern between fantasy and reality. However, certain fantasy-prone individuals have come to believe that information confabulated during a hypnotic session is real. This mistake is particularly prevalent when adults are hypnotically regressed to early childhood. Although autobiographical memories usually remain intact, real events are often contaminated with fantasy material to fill in the gaps. This ability to confabulate under hypnosis has led to false memories that have resulted in personal trauma and legal intervention. In the Hill case, we are not examining decades-old memories. Only 28 months had passed since the UFO encounter, and Betty and Barney had retold their conscious, continuous memories of the event numerous times. So now we're going to get to the Walter Webb report, and you're going to hear Kathleen Marden talking a little bit about Walter Webb here in a bit, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty of what they recalled under hypnosis, keeping in mind all the qualifiers regarding information that's obtained this way. So here's an overview of the details of what is known as the second encounter, as recalled by Betty and Barney under hypnosis.
By the way, we're going to be using a few brief clips from the hypnosis sessions. We'd like to be clear that the clips we are using are copyrighted by Kathleen Marden and are being licensed for use to Astonishing Legends Productions for tonight's episode. All rights are reserved on this audio, and it is not to be reproduced apart from this episode without Kathleen Marden's express consent. Visit Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com to make inquiries about the audio if you wish to reproduce it elsewhere. I'll quickly add that much of the hypnosis session audio has been published on the internet in other formats, more than what we're going to share tonight, but this has often been done without permission. Barney's family has specified that they do not wish others to use audio of his initial abreaction to the event. This is a psychological term that applies to the sometimes highly emotional response to oppressed events that are recovered in therapy. So out of respect for Barney and his family, we're not going to be playing any clips of that nature. Kathleen has transcripts of all of the audio on her website, at least I believe it's all up there. I know that she's done them, and a lot of it can be read there for sure. We're relying heavily on Walter Webb's second 61-page report on the case, published on August 30th, 1965. Webb based this report on his initial investigations of the case and then the subsequent analysis of 11 hours of tape from Betty and Barney's hypnosis sessions. Most of the hypnosis details relate to the missing time or lost couple of hours that Betty and Barney had on their journey that night. We picked these details up on the edge of what they consciously remembered and recounted before agreeing to be hypnotized by Dr. Simon. After viewing the craft in the field with binoculars and seeing it approach them, Barney became terrified and ran back to Betty in the car in an attempt to flee the scene. He was convinced, after making eye-to-eye contact through the binoculars with one of the humanoid occupants of the craft, that he was about to be captured like a bug in a net. So he fled in terror. It was probably obvious to him that Betty's .32 pistol was not going to be of much use in this situation.
Well, let's now take a listen to an excerpt from Betty's hypnosis session. Here's one of the excerpts where Betty is talking with Dr. Simon. He's asking questions. She's relaying her experience here. This is while under hypnosis and about the moment that Barney came running back to the car.
And when I saw him coming, I sat up, and it's lucky I did afterwards because he threw the binoculars in the car, and they landed on the seat beside me. And I guess he was hysterical. He was, I don't know if he was laughing or crying, but he was saying that they were going to capture us. We had to get the hell out of there. They were going to capture us. And because the car motor was running, and he put the car into first, and he stepped on the gas, and we started to take off very rapidly. And so he kept saying to me, look out and see them. They're right overhead. They're right directly over the head of our car.
So Barney now gets back in Betty's car and they take off. Betty rolls her window down and doesn't see the UFO. Barney thought it was right on top of them, but Betty couldn't see anything. So as you can hear in Betty's preceding hypnosis audio, if the memory is accurate, Barney was convinced it was directly above their car. So then she looks up again, up at the sky, and realizes the stars are blacked out above them. And at that moment, she realizes the craft is blocking them out, the stars that is, and keeping pace with their car. Now, during this time, Barney is driving almost as if on some kind of strange autopilot. He describes a mind voice, quote unquote, telling him to turn off the highway and then turn again down a dirt road deep into the woods. Barney just drove, and Betty didn't understand what was happening.
We're driving along. I don't know where we are. I don't even know how we got here. Barney and I, we've been driving, and I don't know how long, and we haven't even been talking. I just been sitting here feeling that something's going to happen. And I'm not really too afraid. Except right now I am. At that time I didn't feel afraid. Right now, but I wasn't afraid. I was afraid when I saw the men on the road. I've never been so afraid in my life.
They came to a spot in the road where there was a roadblock of sorts, with a group of men, quote unquote, in the road and a glowing orange fireball of some kind in the woods off to the right side of the road. And Barney's first thought was that there had been a car accident or that they were about to be robbed. And in that moment, their car stalled out. The motor died. Barney couldn't get it restarted.
Barney, of course, had to stop. And then he stopped the car, and these men started to come up to the car. They separated. They came up in two groups. And when they started to do that, I got real scared. And the car motor died. The car stalled. And when they started coming up, Barney tried to start the car. He tried to start it, and you know how a motor of a car would just turn over, it won't fire? And he started to start the car.
He did what?
He tried to start the car,
yes.
It won't start. And the men are coming towards us. And I think, well, I can get away from this. If I get the car door open, I can run in the woods and hide. And I'm thinking, and I just put my hand on the car door to open it. And the men come up and they open it for me.
Betty said that as soon as the car door opened, she looked at the man who opened it and fell immediately asleep. When she woke up, she was walking up a path toward the object they had seen in the woods. There were 3 men in front of her and 2 men behind her. She initially thought that when they stopped that there were 10 or 12 in total. The 6 men came towards Barney's side of the car. The mind voice told Barney to close his eyes and keep them shut, and that no harm would come to him. He closed his eyes. Then 2 men lifted him up with considerable strength. At some point, one of the beings found Betty's pistol and removed it from his pocket, leaving it on the seat of the car. Betty thought that Barney looked sound asleep, but Barney said he was afraid to look. Betty yelled at him, "Barney, wake up!" And as soon as she did that, one of the beings said to Betty, "Is Barney his name?" She said the voice was in English, but with a heavy foreign accent. They assured her that Barney was fine and that no harm would come to them. They just wanted to do a few tests and then they would be put back in the car. They approached the landed craft and Betty stopped, not wanting to board it. But again, they told her everything would be fine. She stepped onto a ramp. Barney was still being carried with his eyes closed, but he felt a ramp or sill which he stumbled over.
Is there anything else you're thinking that you haven't told me? Yes. Yes. You can tell me now. I am only thinking of mental pictures because my eyes are closed. And I think I am going up a slight incline and my feet are not bumping on the rocks. That's funny. I thought of my feet bumping on the rocks.
So there's an implication in the prior clip that Barney remembers enough to know that he was being carried and his feet were dragging across the rocks until he got to the ramp onto the craft. While this is a hypnotically recovered memory, which may not be able to be trusted as reality, the tops of Barney's shoes were significantly scuffed when he got home. There's no reasonable conscious memory to explain how they got that way. Betty now remembers a long curved hallway, and she was taken into a small wedge-shaped room. Barney was taken to a second room next door. She was left with a being she called an examiner. She could see an examination table, stool, and other things you might have in a doctor's office, and a bluish-white light was glowing from, I think, from the ceiling. He brought something over that she thought was looking very closely at her skin, some kind of giant microscope or something, and then he scraped her skin on her arm like he was collecting cells. The being she called the leader bagged them up in something that looked like plastic. The examiner looked into her eyes with a light, it's kind of a typical thing, and her mouth, and examined her throat and teeth, swabbed her ear and took a sample and then cut some of her hair and kept it. The being then removed her shoes and examined her feet. Then it unzipped her dress, or tried to. More on this in a moment. Some large machine was then brought over with lots of needles to examine her nervous system. They told her it wouldn't hurt, and it didn't. There was no pain. They checked her in the front and then put her on her stomach and checked her back. It poked her spine, all kinds of things. Then a long needle was brought over as she laid on her back to do a pregnancy test, or that's what they said. This is the early version of a type of test previously unknown to Betty, an amniocentesis, common nowadays. She didn't understand how it could work, but when the examiner inserted this long needle into her navel, she felt excruciating pain. This was the pain that was erased by the examiner simply waving his hand over her eyes. The leader apologized and said they wouldn't have done it had they known it would hurt so bad. After that, she was done. She was able to get dressed and waited for them to finish whatever exam they were giving Barney. It's at this point she's now alone with the leader being, or what she called the leader, and they have a conversation. This is when she recalls asking if she can take something to prove it all happened, and he agrees. Yeah, sure, why not? So she collects a book that she finds in the room with a bunch of symbols written in it in columns. That's when she asked where he was from, to which he said, "What do you know about the universe?" And she said, "Nothing." Well, he then touched the wall or something similar, and then it opened up, revealing a map, one that he pulled down. He showed her a star system with trade and exploration routes. The leader laughed at her when she didn't know where Earth was relative to the map and put it away. She described a note of sarcasm. It's at this point a group comes back in with Barney's dentures. They opened her mouth trying to see if her teeth came out too. They were all talking in a way that she couldn't understand. She mentioned old age being a reason for dentures, and this was another concept they didn't get. They talked about vegetables and colors too, including the color yellow, but the leader didn't seem to understand that either. She wanted them to meet people who could better answer their questions. Most frighteningly, she asked, how would they ever find her if they came back? And the leader simply replied, "We always do." One thing that's interesting, and Kathleen, I think, is going to probably bring this up, is that they had different memories about how they were extracted from the car.
Right.
So that's going to come up in our discussion with her for sure. So if you hear inconsistencies about how many people were on his side of the car and her side of the car, that's because those memories were different, which again points to the hypnotic part being maybe not super accurate about every detail. But, I don't know. Like, this is not a great examination. Obviously, a lot of pain, amniocentesis. I've been around for those. I had to look away myself. Talk about closing your eyes. I can't watch that kind of stuff happen, especially to a loved one. But it's not something that she knew about, and it was a procedure that it was in its early stages then. So again, I'm going to ask Kathleen about it, but it's fascinating that was something that she described. I seem to remember reading in Captured that she could not have children either.
Right,
so
right.
They could have just asked her.
Yeah.
She was like, there's not going to be anything going on. But instead, it was horrifying. They stuck that needle in her belly button. So...
Right. But before I forget, I wanted to express one concept that I found interesting that came from a supposed abductee when talking about nightmares of abductions, memories, dreams versus conscious, I guess, memories of it happening to you after it has passed versus what a lot of abductees claim happens in their recurring nightmares or dreams. And I thought it was a very significant point because this abductee, and I think this was also in that Unsolved Mysteries, so it's quite a while ago, but it had to do with the Allagash abduction, if you remember, also in Maine.
Yeah.
Again, another very compelling case because they all split up. They all recounted, under hypnosis, I believe, the same experience with the same details once split up, all having regression hypnosis performed on them separately. And then when they brought together, one interesting thing one of the guys said is that we were all brought together as a group and talking to the hypnotist or the psychologist who was interviewing them, that they would finish each other's sentences as they were describing it because they all experienced the same thing. It was so embedded in their subconscious as it really happened. It wasn't like they were all fabricating different stories that were kind of loosely the same. All the details were the same under hypnosis. And one of the guys said, listen, I know people say that was just a dream. It's just a recurring vivid or even lucid dream. It's just a nightmare. It didn't really happen. Or something else weird happened and you're just adding details. He said, look, it's like in a dream, how just weird things happen. People float in, they float out. Somebody's supposed to be somebody else in the dream, but they don't look like them. You just know it's like, oh, that's supposed to be my dad, but it looks like it looks like the mailman.
Had that exact dream, actually. I had one with my own son. I was like, that's my son. Other times I've had a dream where I know the person's there, but I can't even see them, but I know they're there with me.
Yeah, exactly. You just kind of know, but weird things happen, as one of my favorite Mitch Hedberg jokes goes. It's like, dreams are so weird. The next thing you know, you have to build a go-kart with your old landlord. Just what? This doesn't make any sense. But what the experiencer said is that, no, this is different in that you have the same exact dream with the same details super vividly, and you think about it all day long, every day for years. You can't think of anything else. It's like, that's not a dream.
Well, that's like the dream. I've talked about it on the show before that I used to have about the crazy monkey skeleton and all the skin came off and the skeleton chased me around the house.
Have you talked?
I told you. You don't see. You don't even see. Talk about don't pay attention to me.
No,
I've mentioned this.
I do remember something about a naked monkey skeleton.
It wasn't naked. It was skeletal.
Well, but in this case, though, seriously, these abductees all say, no, it never changes. All the details are the same. You have, the same exact details. And each of the four guys had the same exact details when undergoing regression hypnosis, once again. So that's just an odd thing that they would all have the same, mind meld link.
Well, let's talk about Barney's hypnosis sessions. Now, that was mostly about Betty's, even though we heard a soundbite from Barney. Let's talk about Barney now and what kind of frightening things he recounted, because I'm going to say this one worries me a little bit more, although I do not want the needle in the navel. There's some stuff that happened here that's pretty freaky.
It's interesting about the hand waving, too. Is that part of just lore? Like, I always wonder, does, when a Jedi uses the Force, do they need to use the hand? Does Yoda need to put his hand up? Can't they just think that? Well, looking at laying of hands by healers, where the hands are important.
It's the chi. They're focusing their chi.
Yes, there could be a transference of energy. In this case, putting somebody to sleep, a simple human, is best done with a waving of the hand. So that was kind of curious, where they just can't think it. So yes, now let's look at Barney's hypnosis sessions, which also produced equally strange details. So he remembered under hypnosis that he also went into a wedge-shaped room. Now keep in mind, Barney and Betty were not aware of what each other said in each other's sessions. So they're still being separated, right? And they were only introduced later. So at this point, they're just saying what they believe singularly with their own experience, subjectively, under hypnosis.
Yes, to a hypnotherapist who does not believe in UFOs, by the way. So in terms of leading, when it comes down to, and I think Kathleen has the transcripts here, but you'll be able to determine whether or not they both said they went into the same kind of room in separate sessions, and he had instructed them not to be able to remember what they were saying in the sessions after the sessions. That was revealed. Yeah,
it's a good double blind.
So it's an example of what we were just talking about.
Right. You just keep it kind of separately, and then you did the painstaking work that Kathleen does by comparing and contrasting them, every little detail. Where do they match? Where do they differ? Why? When? Having been taken, it's a lot. You have to pour through a lot of records and parse each word here, but she did. But what's interesting about the similarities, he too described it like an operating room with a pale blue light. And that's what Betty said as well. And he also saw a cabinet with several men being around there. And he closed his eyes and was placed on the table, at which point his shoes were taken off, just like Betty's, but then also his pants were slightly pulled down. Now, at this point, he felt some type of cup device. He said it was like a curved kind of thing being placed around his genitals, and it's his belief that a sperm specimen then was somehow taken. And he said there was no arousal, there was nothing, no kind of sensation at that time. It was just extracted from him. There was no feeling, there's no emotional feeling associated with that procedure.
That particular detail might not be in the web report. I can't remember, but it is a detail that he shared at another time. I know it's in the book captured. So.
Now, I apologize because I can't remember if we talked about this, but it was one of the scarier, more vivid and just visceral details that Barney said, I believe, under his hypnosis sessions. And that's about one of the beings getting right in his face physically. And he felt like his eyes were pressing into his eyes.
Mm.
Now you can say like physically, well, that's impossible. You're going to touch eyeballs. What are his germs like? You're going to get pink eye. So this alien, though, he claims like got right close in his face, pressed his eyes, as Barney said, and I think it's metaphorically, like the alien pressed his eyes and they went into Barney's eyes. Now, let's say if it's not some kind of interdimensional overlapping of matter here or insertion of matter into the other, which Kathleen will talk about a little bit as far as the abduction process. I think what happened, and this scared Barney, is that it basically is like looking into his soul. I gathered that it was more metaphorically like this thing looked so deep and hard and directly into his eyes that he felt like this thing's eyes were now going into and behind Barney's eyes.
Right.
And that terrified him immensely because you couldn't get this thing out of your eyes. Imagine, your eyes are very sensitive. You get poked in the eye, you get anything near them, smoke, dust, a finger, it is irritating and you immediately turn away. Unless you're petting your dog and you actually touch their eyes, you know that? And then they don't flinch. It's like, whoa, I guess their eyes are tougher.
Just found it here on page 113 of Captured. It's talking about when he was extracted from the car. And he said he had the impression that if I did think of my gun, I would be harmed.
Right.
As three men assisted him out of the car, he felt two eyes coming close to his, seemingly pushing into his eyes, and he was helpless to resist.
Yes.
Then his mind went blank. He closed his eyes, and he thought of nothing more.
Okay, so that happened during the physical grabbing, right? The physical
Yes.
abduction part, not the examination part. But I remember that standing out of that being some kind of psychic intrusion. This seemed more like a technique and what he perceived as this thing was oppressing him and making him docile and subduing him.
Yeah. There you go. It's like I said in part one about getting the shark to balance on its nose and go and chill out.
That's right. That's right. Or rubbing the alligator's stomach from head to tail.
Which way do I do it? I don't know. Just run away. Okay.
Well, now here's another aspect of it that often gets made fun of, and it's one of the seminal instances of this. He also remembered something cylindrical being placed into his rectum, and he thinks that something was extracted in that case as well.
Yeah.
Well, that also makes sense medically because you can learn a lot from a stool sample.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think this is the case in that this does not happen that often in most abduction cases. You don't have the quote-unquote anal probe.
That people remember.
Well, I guess that you don't remember or do remember, but that, of course, is what people focus on, and that becomes the running joke.
Yeah.
Because it is such an invasive thing. But I don't believe that most abductees will report that as having happened, or, like as you said, don't remember it. The other one, Whitley Strieber, I think also reported that. And of course, there you go. It's set. It happens to every abductee, and that's the joke.
Yeah.
Well, both remembered, though, both Barney and Betty remembered hearing the crew members talking to each other, and both said it sounded like mumbling or kind of a humming sound of some kind. I found that fascinating, that it was like mumbling or something through a membrane, that the membrane vibrated and sounds came out, but it wasn't like regular speech or anything, of course, she could understand. But they also spoke English to her. And as we said a little earlier, one spoke English, but with a heavy foreign accent. Now, what's that about? Did they abduct Europeans first, and then, one has an Italian accent, one has a Scottish accent?
I mean, they never described anyone who was decidedly human, but I did wonder if there were humans among the crew.
That's a possibility. That's something that Terry Lovelace claimed, that when he was frozen and he could move his eyeballs around, he saw humans, not humanoids, human crew members. That was one of the more fascinating aspects of Terry's story, and that what it purports to claim, I guess, is that there is some kind of cooperation or collusion with Earth military people or some kind of official people, because they had on jumpsuits or uniforms with an orange circular patch. Which I also found interesting, that not only did he remember that, but what does that signify? Earth's sun? I don't know. But he remembered that. He said it was so detailed. He remembered one being what he thought was a Hispanic woman in her late 30s, early 40s with a ponytail.
Yeah.
Again, it could be an implanted memory, but just interesting that we're already cooperating with them, and some of us are on board. Now imagine having that job. That's something you can't tell anybody, your friends, relatives. What do you do for a living? Can't really say. So anyway, Betty said that they just could not be understood, but Barney felt it was all telepathic. Betty couldn't be sure whether her communication from them was verbal or mental, but both thought they had been verbal in communication to them. So that's also interesting. It's not like they didn't see their mouths move. Sometimes you hear about that, thoughts, and it's like they're speaking to you, but the mouth isn't moving. There's just the words and thoughts are already in your head, and you respond either by thinking or actually speaking, and they get it. In this case, Betty thought that they were actually moving their mouth, sounds coming out, but it's something they could understand when they wanted them to.
Right.
Now, both Barney and Betty thought that they were aboard the ship for about 30 to 40 minutes total.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Their perception of that amount of time was 30 to 40 minutes under hypnosis. What I thought about when I heard this was, well, you have to wonder if they were missing close to 2 hours. Some said it was between 2 and 3, depending on, where they were driving and how long it should have taken them. And I spent a lot of time today on Google Earth looking at where could this have been? They had the road trip, then they got off the road, they went way into the woods. This stuff happened to them, then they had to get back on the road, and it took a minute to get back to Route 3 or whatever they call it, Highway 3 that they were on. So maybe they were only on there 30 to 40 minutes, or maybe it was more like 2 hours and it felt like 30 to 40 minutes, or they made it feel that way, if you believe any of this at all, which, we'll talk about a little bit in the conclusions. But after the exam was done, they were just told to wait until the ship left. And Barney already can't remember or starting to lose his memory of what was happening. He realized that he didn't really know where they were, like why they were out in the woods. And when he got in the car, he actually sat down on the gun.
Right.
And poor Delcy, the dachshund, was shaking underneath the seat.
Yeah, imagine what the dog saw, because the dog has not been put out.
Yeah. What did the dog see? It reminds me of our friend Marie Mayhew talking about poor Snowball in the Delphus Ring story.
Right.
Snowball the dog. But here's the thing. Betty seemed kind of happy. She invited Barney to come back out of the car and watch the UFO leave. It's like you're waving at a cruise ship that's sailing off into the distance with your friends on it. She seemed like, okay, this is cool. Let's wave goodbye. They held Delcy, who was still shaking as it took off. The ship itself was very dark, and then it started glowing orange as it flew up into the sky and became brighter and brighter. It then went down behind a ridge before shooting up into the sky and diminishing down to a tiny point just in a few seconds. As they started driving away, all of their immediate memories of what had happened to them began fading, which this made me think of how a lot of times when you wake up in the morning and you were having a dream, it's like, oh my God.
Exactly.
And just within 10 or 15 seconds, it's gone.
Yeah. It starts to evaporate.
Or maybe 30 seconds. And then that's like, if you don't write it down right then, you're going to lose it. Like it'll just go away. It's such a strange feeling. Maybe they can induce this somehow. But Betty supposedly said to Barney at some point, do you believe in flying saucers now? And he answered, oh, Betty, don't be ridiculous. That wasn't a flying saucer.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that dialogue is necessarily related to their direct memories of what happened to them on the ship. I think it's the dialogue that they had after they were put back in the car and didn't realize what had happened.
Right.
And it's based on what the investigator Webb called the first encounter, which was the binoculars and looking and seeing the thing come down towards the car.
Right.
Not the second encounter. I think the second encounter was already maybe out of their memories, but I don't know that. That's just, it's interesting to me there because I don't think it's like, do you believe in flying saucers now? Because we were just stripped and probed.
Right.
It's not that, I don't think. I think it's, do you believe in flying saucers now? Because we saw this one come down to the car and it chased us and now we're driving home. That's what I think it is.
Also, I think it's shaded by how they each viewed their experience. As we just said, I believe from what we've come across that Barney's experience was much more terrifying. Betty's experience was, it's unnerving, unpleasant, weird, and unsettling and scary, but there were also moments of great interest, maybe depending on their personalities and how they accepted it and viewed it. And Barney seems like he's much more in denial of it, because it was so much more traumatic that wasn't a flying saucer at all. And also he was the one who first thought it was a jetliner until it made a move that was impossible for a jetliner to make. And he said, okay, he didn't say UFO. He said, that's not a plane.
Also, it plays into that whole idea that in paranormal events, UFOs and even ghosts and hauntings and other types of events, people that are right there together often experience different things.
Oh, sure. No, there's people that just will be seeing the same thing standing next to somebody who said, that's a flying saucer just landing there. Person said, no, it's a street lamp.
Right.
And in that regard, there are some counterpoints to Betty's experience and what she experienced later in life as she continued to be enthused by UFOs and going out and seeing them. One example is that John Oswald, who's listed here as a UFO enthusiast, when asked about Betty's continuing UFO observations, Oswald stated, she is not really seeing UFOs, but she is calling them that. And on one night they went out together, quote, Mrs. Hill was unable to distinguish between a landed UFO and a street light. So that's kind of a dig at her, but I don't know John Oswald's point, if he's really listed as a UFO enthusiast or UFO debunker or what his stance is. But I don't discount that, because I think when you've gone through this kind of an experience, your perception has been irrevocably changed.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like, your sense of what's real and what's possible, and your mind's library of possible images and experiences has been altered. And
Yes.
not saying that what she saw wasn't a street light. It may have been, but in her experience, that could be very similar to what she'd already experienced or has seen, or it was very similar to what a possible UFO had looked like, or that she had experienced in some fashion, or she really did see one, and Mr. Oswald here just saw a street light.
Right. It could go either way. And I get that, and I mentioned on the show that about a year ago or a year and a half ago now, I saw something flying low in the sky that was very, very unusual. And I had a friend with me, and he insisted that it was a drone.
Right.
And it was obvious to me that it wasn't, like painfully obvious, not only by the types of lights it had, but the fact that it wasn't that high up and it made no sound at all. And it wasn't large. It was small, like a drone. But it was dead silent, and then also as it went into the distance, it split into two different sets of lights that went in different directions, which he also saw. But he was staying with me as a guest at my home. We came inside and talked about it for an hour or two, and he just was like, no, it was a drone. It was a drone. It's like he refused to believe that it might not be a drone. And I was refusing to believe that it was a drone, not because I want to believe, but because I'm pretty careful about what I'm observing because of our show, and I'm paying attention to all the little details. But the main thing about every drone I've seen, and I've seen a lot at the house that I was at when this happened, is they always have the buzzing sound.
Right.
And this one had none, especially at a lower altitude.
Right.
Zzz, it wasn't doing that. It was dead silent. It's very unusual. It's craft, but that's my point. My friend was like, no, it's a drone. It had to be a drone. But it's just because he couldn't accept that it might not be something easily explained.
This is Todd Sturgill, and when I'm not drawing cryptids, I listen... Oh, who am I kidding? Especially when I draw cryptids, I listen to Astonishing Legends. Now back to the show.
Okay, a little bit of background on Kathleen Marden. Kathleen's insatiable interest in UFOs and ET contact began in 1961 when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a close encounter and UFO abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. As a family member, Kathleen gained firsthand knowledge of Betty and Barney's UFO encounter on the day they arrived home, and 2 days later, she, her parents, and siblings visited the Hills' home. She has devoted years to painstaking investigation of the Hills' anomalous events and archival research on their UFO abduction case. As the trustee of Betty's estate, she selected files from Betty's personal archival collection for a permanent collection at the Milne Special Collections Library at the University of New Hampshire. You will find her case study of the evidence in her book with Stanton Friedman, which we've been referencing a lot in this series, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, which was updated in 2021 with the 60th anniversary edition. It's the 60th anniversary of the original encounter, by the way, not the first publishing of the book. Since 1991, she has volunteered for the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, in various positions, such as Director of Field Investigator Training and Founder-Director of MUFON's Experiencer Resource Team, or ERT. Over a 10-year period, Kathleen expanded her ERT team from 3 members to 45 trained, seasoned specialists and attracted PhD and MD psychological and research consultants. Additionally, she sat on the Edgar Mitchell Free Advisory Board. In this period, she worked on 3 studies on nearly 5,000 experiencers: the Marden Stoner, Edgar Mitchell Free, MUFON ERT. She is presently working on the Marden-Barton Survey of Religious Beliefs and Extraterrestrial Life, which is available on her website. As of right now, she has appeared as an on-camera commentator on 55 television and video productions. Additionally, she has spoken on innumerable radio shows and podcasts, such as ours, and has lectured across the United States and to audiences in foreign countries. She has authored and co-authored numerous books and articles in UFO magazines and journals. 2 of her books are available in foreign languages. She is the recipient of 2 major awards from MUFON and the International UFO Congress for her years of dedicated work. For additional information, see her website at www.kathleen-marden.com. Kathleen, welcome to Astonishing Legends. It is truly an honor to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you.
We understand you're a very busy person. You seem to be traveling a lot and doing a lot of speaking, and not just on this case, but on other things at large. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
I began all of this when I was 13 years old, when my aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had their experience, and was sort of a firsthand witness to Betty's and Barney's emotional reaction and curiosity and everything that went on, even when Dr. Simon was allowing them to remember what they said under hypnosis. They would stop by and I would hear what they remembered. I met most of the original investigators and I was very impressed by what they did. When I was a kid, Nancy Drew mystery novels were my favorite books to read.
Absolutely.
And so I guess I've always been kind of a detective. You know, I grew up, I went to the University of New Hampshire, studied to become a social worker, specializing in psychiatric social work, and I really didn't enjoy it that much. And I moved to Cincinnati, where my former husband was studying for his doctorate in the philosophy of psychiatry. And I tried to get a job in psychiatric social work and in the hospital there, and they didn't want a little blonde girl off the farm of New Hampshire.
Oh,
and so I had to look for something else, and I found a job teaching in the inner city.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In Cincinnati, and I absolutely loved it. So I did graduate work in education and ended up being an educator and an education services coordinator until, probably about 1988, 1990, right in that time frame. I left that profession in order to investigate my aunt and uncle's experience and to become a writer, which was the thing that I always wanted to do when I began college. But my Aunt Betty told me, "You'll never make any money as a writer, Kathy. Do something practical." So I followed her advice.
So 25 or 30 years after everything happened, that's when you came back to it and decided to get down in the dirt on it, as it were.
Yes. Now, all along, I followed it because Betty and I had a close relationship. Even when I moved away to Cincinnati, for example, we would spend holidays back in New Hampshire and the summers in New Hampshire. So we never lost that connection. And Betty visited me as well.
How far apart in age were your mom and Betty as sisters?
They were 10 years apart. Betty was 10 years older than my mother.
Okay. Let me ask you this. We did talk a little bit in this episode, which of course you haven't heard, about Betty and Barney as people, how they met, their background working in civil rights, being in the Unitarian Universalist Church and that sort of thing. They seem like, from Captured anyway, like very charming, outgoing, nurturing, intelligent folks. And so I just wanted to know from somebody who actually knew them, what were they like as people, both of them? How do you remember them when you look back on them? I mean, obviously you spent a long time with Betty. She lived so much longer than Barney, but like with Barney as well, how do you remember the two of them?
Well, I remember Betty from the time I was born because my parents were renting an apartment right next door to where Betty and her first husband were living. So Betty was always there. I mean, the first word I said was her name. So
wow.
I knew her quite well. And then when I was 2 years old, my parents moved to Kingston from Portsmouth and built a house right across the street from my grandparents. That's my mother's and Betty's parents.
Okay.
So Betty would come to the house at least once a week. We were a close family. She was at the University of New Hampshire finishing up on her degree. And I remember her with a big butterfly net. She was taking entomology classes and she would be running around the farmlands, catching bugs and putting a long needle through them onto a board for her entomology class.
Some parallels there, I guess. Wow.
Yes. And so she was just always sort of a good role model for me. I sort of admired her because she was college educated. My mother was highly intelligent, but had never been able to go to college. She married when she was only 18 years old. But Betty went to college. She finished it. She was a leader, and she graduated and she became a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, a welfare worker, and then she worked in adoption. She eventually became a supervisor in the welfare department. And she married Barney in 1960. They had been seeing each other, I think, for about 3 years, maybe a little more than that.
Okay.
And they had met at Hampton Beach. She was working summers at the beach. I believe that's how they met. He was there and they struck up a friendship. And at that time, she was divorced from her first husband. And she was having a house remodeled.
Yes.
It was an apartment house. And she had it moved to new land in Portsmouth and completely remodeled inside and out. And so she told Barney that if he came back to Hampton Beach, that she would be willing to rent one of those efficiency apartments to him during his summer vacation. So they sort of struck up a friendship and they wrote to one another and talked on the phone. Betty told me they never planned to get married, but they fell in love. She was fully aware of the challenges that they would face, particularly Barney, married to a white woman in 1960.
Yeah.
But they were both strong people. Barney was more introspective than Betty. When he spoke, he thought about what he was going to say. He used better vocabulary than Betty. She was just down to earth and very friendly to people, outgoing. But Barney was very proud of his reputation.
Oh, okay.
And did very good things. He was a member of the NAACP.
Yes.
So in 1965, it was a great year for Betty and Barney. They started out with an invitation to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration because they were politically active. And since they were my role models, I was politically active in high school, and I went with them. I received an invitation as well and had a wonderful time at the inauguration in Washington. It was one of the highlights of my life.
Must have been amazing.
It was absolutely amazing. That same year, Barney received an award from Sergeant Shriver for the work that he and Betty and a group of people from Rockingham County, New Hampshire had done to set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program. He was the committee chairman of that. And he was also elected to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission State Advisory Committee.
Okay.
In addition to this, he had received an award from the Archdiocese in Manchester, New Hampshire, for the literacy program that he had set up so that illiterate people in the state of New Hampshire could learn to read and therefore be able to vote, because we had reading tests in those days.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So it started out as just a really great year. But in late August, early September of that year, they received a letter from John Luttrell. And John Luttrell was an award-winning newspaper reporter for the Boston Traveler. And in the letter, he named a woman that Betty knew. It was the wife of a naval officer. And she knew all about Betty's and Barney's experience with the craft and had listened to some of the audio from their hypnosis as well. And this woman had violated confidentiality and had given a lot of information to John Luttrell. He wrote to Betty and Barney, and he had a phone call with them as well. And he promised them that he would not commercialize it in any way if they would speak to him. And they said, absolutely not. We're not even going to speak to you about this. And they actually saw a lawyer about this as well. John Luttrell, however, did a fantastic investigation through speaking with NICAP, with Project Blue Book, by finding at that point 6 witnesses to the craft that night, and had even talked to Betty's and Barney's neighbors about them. He wanted to know about their reputations in the community. So he published those articles for 5 days in a row in the Boston Traveler in late October of 1965. And this caused a huge change in Betty's and Barney's lives. I remember the night that they came down to my grandparents' house, and we all met as a family to decide what to do next. Barney was extraordinarily distressed over this, because here he was, a leader in the state of New Hampshire with a fantastic reputation. And now he was being portrayed as a man who claimed he was abducted by aliens.
Right.
I mean, there is a taboo against that. And the taboo was even greater in 1961.
Wow.
And so it was so difficult for Barney. It was difficult for Betty, too. She thought she might lose her job. Reporters contacted her supervisor, and he said that he wished that he had more people like Betty, that she was a very fine welfare worker. So she was pleased with that. And the family decided that since the cat was already out of the bag, that Betty and Barney should speak publicly for the first time. And so a few days later, they spoke at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Dover, New Hampshire. They were introduced by the public information officer from Pease Air Force Base, who initially talked about UFO sightings in the area, and that if anyone did see a UFO, they would like for them to report it to Pease. And then he introduced Betty and Barney. And so they went up on stage and they talked about their sighting and their close encounter. They did not talk about the abduction. They weren't ready to talk about that.
What's interesting about this, and I'll tell you something that's interesting to me, because my wife works in television, and we have, over the years, because some of the people she works with are actors, we have been pursued by reporters in this exact scenario, trying to dig up, in this case, dirt on folks that we knew didn't have any dirt on them because we knew them very well. We never spoke to them. And then the piece comes out and it's filled with lies, like blatant lies that we can confirm are lies. So in one way, they're lucky that Luttrell did his due diligence and saw those people and all that. But in another way, it's not really fair to out people that don't want to be outed in terms of having this experience. I feel bad, especially as you portray them and in their careers, and Barney in particular, who was so proud of his reputation, to have all of that changed forever by this series of articles. So that was 4 years after it happened too, right? So they probably thought they might be out of the woods in terms of, this happened, we've kept it quiet, we're going to move on with our lives, and then this expose comes out.
That's right. It was devastating to Barney. Yeah. I noticed a change in him. Dr. Simon's work with him had really helped Barney. He was happy again. He was highly productive. He marched with Martin Luther King. His work in civil rights was able to continue. And then suddenly, here he was with the press wanting to speak to him and to Betty about an entirely different topic.
Yeah.
And so that was extraordinarily difficult for a man who was very concerned about his reputation.
Sure. And also it's what's near and dear to his heart is civil rights. He doesn't want to direct it over to this experience that he probably can't explain and and had a lot of trauma from, I imagine.
Absolutely.
One quick question. This is a fact question I was curious about. When they spoke at the church in Dover, was that their regular church, Unitarian church, or did they go to the one in Portsmouth?
They went to the one in Portsmouth.
Okay. That was a guess that we made earlier, and I was wondering. It's called South Church, I think?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And John Papandrew was the minister at that time.
Okay. I want to circle back a little bit on some of the earlier experiences before we get further down the road into the aftermath of it, because you were there, and it's so rare that you get to talk to people who experienced the actual events, especially on our show. I mean, sometimes we're talking about the Pied Piper. That was obviously a long time ago, but there's other cases where it's a little more current, but we can't get in touch with anyone. So I think our listeners would love to hear, like, what do you remember of that night that the call came in from Betty to your mom about what had happened to them?
Well, I had just arrived home from school that day, and my mother was on the telephone with Betty. My mother had the ironing board set up, and her ashtray was on the end of it, and she was ironing my father's clothes, and she had the telephone holding it with her shoulder, and
Sure.
and then smoking a cigarette and trying to
the 60s
range all of those things together. And so she'd put the cigarette down, and you'd see, as she was talking, the ash would grow longer and longer in the ashtray. And so I was watching it to make sure that it didn't fall out onto the ironing board. It was just that sort of thing. And I was listening to my mother, and she seemed very concerned. So what I found out is that Betty was telling my mother that the previous evening they had this close encounter with a flying saucer, and that it came so close to them that they were afraid they'd been contaminated. They'd taken long showers, and they were wondering what they should do about this, who they could get in touch with. Now, we had a neighbor who was a physicist, and so my mother said to Betty that she would call him when he arrived home from work and ask for his advice. So Betty hung up the phone. It was about dinner time, I guess, when my father's best friend came to visit. He always stopped by for coffee on his way home from work. He was the chief of police in a little town.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
We started talking about what Betty had said. And so he said, when you talk to Betty, tell her to tell Barney to get in touch with Pease Air Force Base and file a report, because Pease has asked all the local police stations to have people who had UFO sightings to file reports with Pease. So being the good citizens that they were, Betty and Barney called Pease the next day. But then, as time went on, the physicist arrived home. My mother talked to him, and he told Betty that if she had a compass, she should take it out to the car to see how the needle reacted to the metal, if anything was unusual. Of course, we know if you put it up by the battery, the needle is going to rotate, and it will fluctuate a little bit on that old metal of the car. I've done experiments with that.
Yeah.
And there is a bit of a fluctuation, but that isn't what happened to Betty and Barney when they went out. Betty spotted new shiny spots on the trunk of the car that had not been there the previous day. She held the compass in her hand over those spots, and when she put it near the spots, the needle rotated rapidly. She said it would spin and spin. And then when she would take it to another part near the front of the car, it dropped down. And Barney, of course, was highly skeptical still.
Sure.
And so he said to Betty, first of all, he didn't want to try it. And then she sort of talked him into holding the compass himself and trying the same experiment. And the same thing happened to him. And the compass needle would rotate rapidly in that one area. So it was very startling to Barney. And he, during hypnosis, in fact, said to Dr. Simon when he was reliving this part that he just wanted to forget about it. No good could come of it. Just forget about it and not tell anyone. You know, that was, I think, part of Barney's problem, part of the reason that he eventually ended up with bleeding ulcers and that high level of anxiety related to this experience that he had.
Did they bring the car over to you? Did you witness some of this compass behavior as well? Or
I saw the spots on the car a day or two later.
Right.
We talked my father into leaving work early and driving us to Betty's and Barney's house so that we could hear what happened ourselves. And so Betty took us outside, and I was able to see those spots. And my mother was with Betty. I'm not sure if they had the compass or not.
Right.
It was the two of them. And of course, we were the kids.
Right.
So I was just lifting my younger brother, who was 5 years younger than I, up so that he could see the spots too. And I had a brother who was 2 years younger. He was there attempting to rub the spots off. They would not rub off. But then my mother became very concerned and said, "Get away from those spots. You know, you might be injured by them." And
Right.
so we ended up being led back into Betty's house. And Barney and my father sat quietly in a corner of the room, which was highly uncharacteristic of Barney. He was very jovial. And whenever we came, we had a great time with him. He was always very interested in what we were doing at school, and he would play checkers or chess with us. So he was someone that we really looked forward to seeing. But Betty told us that we had to leave him alone that day. And he was sitting in the corner waiting for Pease Air Force Base to call back again. And he was talking quietly with my father. And later on, when I was doing my investigation, my father told me that Barney was very clear about what he remembered about looking up at that craft through binoculars and seeing these entities that were somehow not human looking down at him, dressed in black, shiny uniforms. They frightened him terribly.
I'm a little bit of a motorhead. I was just curious where the blue and white 57 Chevy went. Do you guys know where it is?
I do not know where it is. Many people have looked for it.
I saw that online because I was like, I wonder if somebody's probably already done this. I was like, I wonder if there's a VIN number or something. People were like, all these 57 Chevy clubs were looking for it. And I was just curious if anybody knew where it went.
Absolutely. They looked. Betty had sold the car to her daughter and her daughter's husband. He was in the Air Force, and they drove it to the next base that they went to when they were stationed at another base. And then her daughter told me that they had ended up trading it in for a new car. Or a different car. So after that, I have no idea. Yes.
Right.
You know, so it went to a dealer, you know, who knows, it might have been crushed for scrap metal.
Does anyone have the VIN number, or is that long gone?
I have something in my collection. I'm not sure. I think it could be the VIN number. I know that I had sent years ago when men started contacting me looking for that vehicle.
Yeah.
I was sending something to them. So it was probably the VIN number.
Even with that.
They couldn't find it. No.
I had a question that seemed maybe significant or remarkable, that the Pease Air Force Base had made a request to local police authorities to have people send reports of anything they've seen to them, the Air Force Base there. Is the area known for sightings? Was it a common thing? And maybe there is more coordination that happens between the military and local law enforcement that we don't know about, but it just seems, they seem very open to receiving reports. Whereas, you know the story. Most of the time you ask, you call them up and it's like, hey, were there lights in the sky? Are you doing operations or maneuvers? And they say nothing to report. And so they get kind of a rejection. So it seemed kind of significant that they would be that open. Is there, was that area, Lancaster, Franconia Notch, known for sightings or strange things in the sky?
There were reports of other sightings. After this, all of this became public in 1965, there were many sightings in that area of New Hampshire. There was a flap, and people were going out all the time. The Incident in Exeter by John Fuller was a book about Norman Muscarello, an 18-year-old man who had just graduated from high school and was going into the service, and two police officers. One of those police officers had a close encounter when he took Norman back to the area where the craft had come down low, and both of them witnessed that craft at treetop level.
How far is that from the area that Betty and Barney's experience was?
It is a couple of hours drive between the two, but Betty and Barney lived in Portsmouth, which was 2 towns over.
Yes, and I remember reading about Incident at Exeter and Captured. That sounded like a fascinating story. There was another one called Bluff Ridge.
Yes, Buff Ridge by Walter Webb. That was a very interesting case. And he was the investigator who investigated the Hills case. He was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. And he had actually worked with Dr. Alan Hynek on the satellite program. Webb was a volunteer. And Dr. Hynek was Project Blue Book's astronomical consultant.
Yes.
As well. So, all of it sort of fits together. But the Buff Ledge case is very interesting. It took place at a girls' camp, and this was on Lake Champlain.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes. There were 2 people. There was the lifeguard, a young woman who was in college, and then there was a high school boy who was in charge of picking up everything that was on the beach, taking care of all the equipment. So it's the end of the day. There's a swim meet that night. So just about everybody had left to go to the swim meet. And the 2 of them were out on the dock, and they were just there looking at the stars when they saw this craft come in, this large craft, and out of it came a smaller craft. And one of these smaller craft came down, went into the water, and then rose up from the water again and started heading in their direction. And, it came quite close to them. And they described the entities on board this oval craft with sort of a clear top on it, like a clear portal, as being sort of having like frog-like eyes, big eyes, is the way they explained it, with this ridge over the top. And they remembered that well. And then they were missing time. And by the time they were aware that they were back on that dock and they were heading up toward the camp, the swimmers had come back from the meet. And there was another witness to the craft. It wasn't just them. A very interesting and terrific study that Walter Webb did, investigation of this case. He was a good and conservative investigator. Years later, Webb was able to find the woman who was now married and at a university and had children. And he contacted her and stated that he would maintain confidentiality, and he did. And also the young man who had grown up, and hypnotherapists worked with both of them separately, sort of like Dr. Simon did with Betty and Barney. And they each relived their experience separately under hypnosis. And then Walter Webb did a comparative analysis of their statements. They ended up in the same room on tables inside the craft being examined. Betty and Barney were in separate rooms, but it was not an experience that they really wanted to remember or focus on. And luckily for them, the public was completely ignorant as to who they actually were. So they were able to go on and live normal lives.
There was a story a year or 2 ago that summer camp has been sold to a couple now who are going to try and refurbish it and use it as a vacation spot. And The article, I think, makes little mention of that other than just very briefly, I think, if at all. But that was a very remarkable case because of the number of witnesses and the extent of it. Do you see any connections between that or any similarities between that type of experience and what Betty and Barney went through?
It's somewhat similar to what Betty and Barney went through. Betty and Barney were traveling in a vehicle. These young people were down on the dock, but being taken to craft, undergoing physical examinations, being released, having their memories of what happened when they were on that craft completely erased. I had amnesia for that, but had memories of what happened initially, of the sighting of the craft as it came in close, and they were able to see non-humans on the craft.
Going off of that question, just as a follow-up, do you know of any other case that sounds like it may have been the same set or crew of extraterrestrials where it's so closely matched that you thought maybe it's the same methodology or procedure that were used to study Betty and Barney that pops up in another case that you may have studied?
Well, as a UFO abduction researcher, I had many cases of people who had that type of experience. In the early years, there was a case in Kentucky where 3 women were celebrating the birthday of one of these women. It was Casey County, Kentucky. And they drove up to a restaurant and had some dinner and had a great time. They did not have anything to drink that was alcoholic, I have to say that. And as they were driving home, they saw what they thought was a plane coming in very rapidly and perhaps on a crash course. And so they're watching it, and suddenly it stopped above them. And all of a sudden, their car started traveling extraordinarily rapidly. And the one at the wheel was trying to put on the brakes, trying to stop this, and nothing would stop it. I think that the car must have been picked up at that time. And oftentimes I wonder if that's what really happened to Betty and Barney, that the craft, when it went in the direction of their car, after Barney left that field, he stopped the car right in the middle of the road, straddling the yellow line. And because the craft was right overhead, hovering about 100 feet overhead. And so he opened the door, leaving the motor running. The interior light was on, and he had his binoculars resting his elbows on the top of the car, the roof of the car, and looking up at this craft. And he saw this silent, hovering, disc-shaped craft with an intense row of blue-white light emanating from windows. And he stepped back for a better look because the car was shaking a little bit. And when he did, the craft transferred over the road to the other side of the road and an adjacent field. Now, there was a farmer's stand there. There were some apple trees. And Bet and Barney just took the binoculars and walked down the road away from Betty. She remained in the car because she was going to have to pull it to the side of the road if anyone came along. And he stood at the edge of that field, holding the binoculars up to his eyes, looking at this craft that had descended even lower. And he had been a confirmed skeptic. And so he would hold the binoculars up, and then he'd pull them down, and he was shaking his head, and he was saying, "This can't be real. I have to be dreaming." And he'd put the binoculars up again, and there it was. It was still there. And he saw these non-human entities looking down at him. And they frightened him terribly, especially after all but one turned toward a panel that seemed to encircle the interior of the craft, and their arms went up. And when that happened, Barney said that they looked like the size of a pencil, like at arm's length, as he was looking at them through binoculars. And little red lights on fins started to slide out from the craft, 2 of them, and something started to drop down from the bottom of the craft. Well, today we know, and I know as an investigator, that people are taken to craft through that beam. So Barney had the right instinct when he thought that he needed to get out of there and fast. The one at the window terrified him because Barney thought that he had a plan, and that plan was to capture him like a bug in a net. And that's when he pulled the binoculars away from his eyes so forcefully that he broke the leather strap and went running back to the car, screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. As he got into the car, he looked up and the craft was now moving in his direction. He closed the door, he shifted the car into gear, and he went speeding down the highway, trying to get away from this craft. And then it was moments later that he and Betty heard the code-like buzzing sound striking the trunk of their vehicle. And it caused their car to vibrate and for a tingling sensation to pass through their bodies. In fact, Betty felt of the metal on the car, wondering if she'd receive an electric shock, but she did not.
Those details are memories that they have very clearly, right? That's all outside of hypnosis, what you just said.
Yes, that's true. Mm-hmm.
So some of the details that were taken within hypnosis, and this was in one of your early email exchanges with us, you mentioned that you yourself are a retired hypnotherapist and quantum healing hypnosis practitioner?
That's right. I decided to add to my repertoire. Initially, I was very skeptical. I'm a natural skeptic. And so as I was researching and investigating Betty's and Barney's case, I spent a summer at the university doing research and wrote quite a long paper on hypnosis, so the use and misuse of hypnosis with UFO abductees. I just surveyed all of the literature that was available, all of the academic studies on hypnosis. So I knew quite a bit about it, and more than someone who just practices it. And I knew the difficulties that we have with hypnosis, that if a person is a wannabe, for example, if they know a great deal about the topic, you can lie under hypnosis.
Sure.
And if the hypnotherapist is motivated to create an experience for that individual, they can lead them just through the questions they ask into confabulating a story just by feeding them information. It's extraordinarily important that hypnotists do not do this. And most people who work in this field are well educated on that now. They don't do that. So I'm fairly confident that with a little bit of confabulation here and there, if it's done correctly, if you condition the individual that you're working with, that if they are going to fill in information with something they've read or they've seen on TV or they've heard, they won't be able to speak, or they'll become confused, or they'll just tell me, I saw that here, I read that in this book. And that's what I think happened. If you're doing an investigation, this is extraordinarily important. The benefit of hypnosis, really, and hypnotherapy is for therapeutic purposes. Just as Dr. Simon's motivation in working with Barney was to help him to overcome this psychological trauma that had caused physiological problems. And he was the best person for Barney to see, because during World War II, he was a colonel, I think he was a colonel in the Army. He had set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island. And he was highly successful. He had invented use of hypnosis, a new technique using deep trance hypnosis to help veterans returning from the war to resolve these physiological symptoms that they were having that were emotionally induced, and so that they could return home to their families and their jobs, etc. There was the movie Let There Be Light, made about Dr. Simon's work at the Mason General Hospital. It shows Dr. Simon when he was much younger, working highly successfully with these men who were blind without a physiological cause, or were paralyzed, their legs were paralyzed without a physiological cause. And at the end of the movie, it shows them playing baseball and then together getting onto a bus to go home.
Yes, I remember reading about that and Captured. That was John Huston that directed that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I've heard of it, but I have not seen it. But I had heard of it because Forrest and I both studied film before we were podcasters. So, but I wanted to ask a question about that. Then coming back to that, you've obviously heard all 11 hours of sessions with Dr. Simon that they had. Is that correct?
I have 10 hours of hypnosis
10, okay.
tapes.
What's your professional opinion about the sessions and whether or not they were led? I mean, what's indicated and Captured about him anyway is that he himself was not a believer. He wanted to help them from a therapy standpoint. So he's not necessarily leading them. You would think, and maybe now I'm leading you. Was he leading them? Okay. Was he leading them into believing or disbelieving in UFOs, or just trying to help them sort things out? And how much confabulation do you think might have been presented in their sessions?
Well, he was very strongly looking for an alternative reason for them to have had these memories. He wasn't considering any of the evidence, apparently, but he was looking for a psychological cause for all of this. And he at first thought maybe it was ESP. Maybe they had, through ESP, passed this information from one to the other. And then he thought maybe Barney had overheard Betty's dreams. Starting 10 days after this incident, Betty had a series of 5 dreams, and 5 dreams only. And they included consciously recalled information, but then sandwiched in between the consciously recalled information was a UFO abduction. And in this UFO abduction, the entities looked very different from the ones who actually captured Betty and Barney. The ones in Betty's dreams looked sort of like Jimmy Durante. They had large noses. They had black hair. They looked Southern European, thick hair, thick black eyebrows, all human features. Their skin tone was a little bit grayish. Their lips were a little bit bluish. They were dressed in cadet uniforms, caps, and the uniforms with the buttons, all of that. That's not what Betty and Barney saw, obviously. So it was still suggested that perhaps Betty simply relived her dreams and that Barney had absorbed the information in Betty's dreams when he overheard Betty speaking with investigators, and that he had repeated what he knew, but had sort of confabulated his own less detailed story about what had occurred. And this was very interesting to me as a social scientist, because I wanted to first transcribe all of those hypnosis tapes. And I wasn't a good typist in those days. It took me a long time to transcribe 10 hours of hypnosis tapes. But then I began lining up their statements, comparing Betty's and comparing Barney's at every moment along that trip that they described. And finally, the trip through New Hampshire, when they saw the craft, when it was moving in closer to the point of the abduction. And everything matched, except for when they were taken separately. But I do have to say that in Betty's dreams, the entities surrounded the car. That's not what Betty said under hypnosis. That's not what Barney said under hypnosis. They divided in 2 groups. and one group to Barney's side, one group to Betty's side. So there were definite differences between Betty's dreams and Betty's and Barney's hypnosis sessions vis-a-vis those dreams.
And so differences between all three, because their hypnosis sessions were separate. So those were separate from each other. They had different details. And then also, that's another set of data. Her dream had a separate detail about how the actual removal from the car took place.
The removal from the car was different from what she dreamed, I believe. But in hypnosis, it seems like she was hanging on to that Betty told me that she was just too frightened to do a lot of observing. She closed her eyes a lot during her time on that craft. I know that. I started to work with her sort of not under hypnosis, but as close as you can get to it, going back moment by moment. And she actually broke down. She could not go on. So still, she was holding on to some of this trauma years and years later. But they were taken into separate rooms on that craft. And so they underwent essentially the same kind of examinations, except for they, of course, were of different sexes. So
right.
It was somewhat different.
Yes.
Their clothing was removed. Betty's dress was torn in the process. They apparently didn't know how to unzip a zipper. And so Betty had to assist. The dress dropped to the floor. It apparently picked up some metal fragments and some kind of mold or yeast that was on the floor that ended up discoloring the dress. She underwent an examination of the same thing Barney did. They were very interested in their musculoskeletal system, in their joints, in their nervous system, in their human features, their mouths, their ears. They took samples of their hair. They inserted a long needle into Betty's navel, and this occurred years prior to amniocentesis being used in a hospital setting. So it's hard for me to believe that Betty would have known that information prior to her hypnosis session and confabulated that. In addition to that, we have physical evidence now of what might have been blood, but was definitely fluid from Betty's body in the area of her navel, on the lining of the dress, but it had not come from the outside of the dress. It was on the lining only, and it came from the inside in the area of her navel. And the scientist who did the DNA analysis on that thought that it might confirm that that actually did happen to Betty. But under hypnosis, as Betty was reliving this, Dr. Simon had to end the session early because it was so traumatic. Betty was weeping, saying, "Take it out, it hurts, it hurts." And Dr. Simon handed her Kleenex. The tears were streaming down her cheeks. But then the one that she called the leader did something and removed her pain. And she was grateful to him.
Right.
So then the examiner left the room and went to examine Barney in his room. So Barney underwent essentially the same process, but he did not receive a needle in the navel. They took a sperm sample from him. They placed a cup-like device over his groin, and then a circle of little warts or lesions grew. I guess it was a concentric circle from how he described it to Dr. Simon, and because Dr. Simon wanted to see that area and wanted the medical report on it. Barney had those warts removed, and then when he relived that under hypnosis, they grew back, and he had to have them removed again.
I read about those in the book, but I didn't know that it happened twice.
Yes.
Maybe because there was something in the book that suggested, that they were tested and they were not genital warts.
That's correct. They were not genital
warts. There was something else, and they couldn't figure out what it was.
Hi, this is Jazz from San Francisco. Thank you for listening to Astonishing Legends. Now, let's get back to the show.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the new research that you did, some of the stuff that you added in the 60th anniversary edition of the book. There's been some updates, some scientific updates.
Yes.
And you just mentioned actually some of the materials that might have been found on her dress. What are the updates there with regard to that? And did we ever find any of the pink powdery substance that was on it before she hung it outside? Or is that, were any particles of that ever recovered, or is that
The
gone?
pink was there. The scientists who examined it, about 6 different scientists, I believe, did chemical analyses on little samples from the dress. The speculation is that it's either a yeast or kind of a fungus that deposited on that dress when it dropped on the floor, because it was heavily saturated on the bottom part of the dress, and also heavily saturated on the sleeves where those entities wrapped their long fingers around Betty.
Oh, okay. So maybe this was something biological that might have transferred from the beings themselves.
Yes. One of the scientists, a PhD plant scientist who did a scientific analysis, told me that he believed that they had actually sterilized the whole area. They'd used a sterilization process on Betty and Barney. And he believed that it was yeast because in the absence of viruses or bacteria, and if yeast deposited onto that dress, it would grow and flourish. And it was pink in color, and yeast can be pink in color. It also fluoresced under a UV light.
Mm-hmm. The other, just quickly, physical evidence, the watch, the torn zipper, the pink powder, the residue that is, I guess, definitively from Betty that was in the navel area. That's absolutely confirmed.
Definitive. I had a sample of Betty's blood on a disc so that I could cut off a little piece and send it to the scientist. And of course, wearing gloves, taking all of the precautions. Sure. So I would send the disc, a little piece of the disc, and a couple of samples from different areas of Betty's dress for the scientists to study. And the DNA analysis proved that it was Betty's DNA. She could not prove that it was blood because the blood on both samples was so old that she couldn't determine. She could only determine that it was fluid from Betty's body.
Okay. Here's a question that I have about the watch as well, which you have. And by the way, thank you so much for sharing those images with us and the audio files, which we're using in this episode. We really appreciate the ability to license those. The watch, which I had erroneously said in part 1 that I thought that was the time that it froze at, but it was because it was the time she set it to when she got home. Do we know what time it was on before she tried to reset it? She probably wasn't even thinking
remember.
about it.
Yeah, she just didn't remember. She saw that it was not running when she arrived home, although she had set the watch at 10 o'clock that evening, previous evening. And so she went into the house, looked at the clock in the house, and set the watch to the time. 5:16 a.m. is when she and Barney were in the house.
Have you ever had a watchmaker or a scientist do any kind of research on why the watch might have died?
I have not done that because I don't want to lose that watch.
Sure.
There's also, you could see in the photograph, something that is a little bit greenish, kind of a liquid. And I'm wondering if that might have scientific evidence too. Maybe it could answer some questions if scientists did look at it. But I want that watch in one piece. I think that it's really a valuable item. You know, I'm not planning on selling it or anything.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
Just when I give my own archival collection to whomever, some of it will go to the University of New Hampshire. The watch will go there as well. But Betty did give me her jewelry, so I have that.
Speaking from the experience of interviewing lots of folks for our show over the past decade, you're absolutely right to hang on to things, because every time somebody sends something away, it does not come back, or it comes back broken, or a clone of it comes back, or it gets disappeared or lost in the mail or whatever. So you'll never find more sympathetic people than us to say, no, just hang on to it. I was just curious, aside from being a car nerd, this might follow. I'm also a little bit of a watch nerd. So I wonder, like, if some like expert watch person were to like open it up and could see if maybe some of the gears were distorted from a magnetic influence or bent, or somehow that it seemed like it had undergone a strong magnetic influence, or, could be something else a lot simpler. A lot of times they die, but Barney had a watch too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have his, or is that one gone?
I don't have his. He must have thrown it away.
Right. He was like, well, this doesn't work.
Right.
I have a question about the elements that were found. You had sent a sample to Dr. David Soriano for analysis. And again, it's kind of rare, it seems, that anybody would actually take a look at it on a professional level. But the report came back that there were traces of selenium, tellurium, and rhodium.
Yes.
Elements that are very rare for Earth, as you said in the book, much more common found in the universe, or items that make their way to Earth from the universe.
Yes, especially tellurium.
Right. Mm-hmm. And very expensive, very odd things to find on a dress. Was there any hypothesis as to what these elements combined, what their purpose was, or why they ended up on the dress, or what they could have been used for?
Only that the two tenured college professors with 35 years experience in the chemistry department could not find an earthly explanation for how those elements had deposited on Betty's dress.
I always wonder about careers or professions that we don't know about. And it's like, well, yeah, sure. If she was mining lithium in South Africa or something, then she might have this material on her dress or something. Like, what's really odd circumstance on Earth would produce that? But the fact that it's so hard to figure out, and that there doesn't seem to be a connection, it contributes to the veracity of their story, which I think. So when you pile all that stuff up, also Barney's shoes, the whole idea that they were scuffed on the top, and his memories, which are strictly hypnotic, right? Where he thought he was being dragged, or his shoes were being dragged, or was that a conscious memory?
Yes, that was under hypnosis. That was not conscious recall. Right. It was after he was removed from the car, and they were taking him down the path where he felt like he was floating. Only the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks.
Right.
And then he could feel the toes of his shoes slide up a ramp that was smooth and bump at the top of the ramp.
Right. And his shoes had scuff marks on the tops, right? And
they were so deeply scraped. He used the word scraped. They were so deeply scraped that he had to purchase new shoes.
Okay. Do we have the shoes? I can't remember.
Unfortunately, we don't. Barney wore them for yard work afterwards. Remember, he wanted to forget about
No, of course.
this.
I love it. That's a very mundane, like, no, these, well, I can't wear them out anymore. I might as well get some more use out of them, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and then eventually they went to the dump.
Right. Oh my gosh. That's kind of amazing.
Mm-hmm.
You did mention Skinwalker Ranch and Bob Bigelow's involvement, and I think they did find some very strange earth elements while doing a dig underneath the ridge. And I'm not sure if one of them was selenium, but basically used in the making of semiconductors. There are some commercial applications, selenium here, just very generally used in semiconductor and used in photocells and electronics. And I'm just kind of curious if any of the other pieces of evidence that you've come across, are there hypotheses about what and how they may have been applied to technology, that is things we don't understand, or that you've later found out connect to more modern or current technologies? Because that's one thing I like about the case, is that like the amniocentesis and things that were mentioned by Betty and Barney have more meaning as the decades passed with regards to technology and medicine. Has there been any other revelations about what was discovered that I guess there were an aha moment in more current years?
Well, I have to tell you that there were many scientists who met with Betty at her home, and they were very interested in the structure of the craft, how it was set up, anything that she could remember about that craft. I wonder if they taught us about holographic images, for example. Who knows? I mean, that's just speculation. What about implants? Our scientists are working on the possibility of implanting cochlear implants, possibly implants eventually into the brains of Alzheimer's patients, that sort of thing. So implants under scientific analysis were made of crystalline structure and rare earths. And one of those had a structure that was not of this earth. It might be found on a meteor or an asteroid, but not of this earth.
I think it's interesting, too, that the scientists are coming, they're asking for details about the craft. They're past the point of, like, did this happen? You made it all up. They're just like, just tell us about the ship. We're agreeing there's a ship. We want to know about the ship now. That tells you something right there in terms of that kind of research. We worked on a series a while back called The Beth Sphere, which I don't know if you've ever heard of that story. Actually took place in Florida about a family that found a strange metal sphere on their property. Yes.
I've seen that on TV.
Yes. So we did a series on that and actually tracked down one of the children from that family who was a guest on our show. It was a lot of the same stuff. And Hynek came to their house and camped out for like a week and sometimes and spent the night. And this woman now, who was 9 or 10 years old at the time, used to hang out with him. He was like Uncle Alan, you know, but investigating this metal ball that people were like, what is that? You know, but it's when the people start showing up. But that's another case of where it went away to a lab. And when it came back, it didn't do any of the stuff it used to do. That's one of those stories.
They either broke it or they returned a sphere that wasn't the original or something. I think they tended to break it. But...
Well, they're looking for isotopic ratios, you know, not of this earth. And that's important. But so many other things. Imagine if our military had the technology to just point something at an enemy soldier, and without killing that soldier, that person would just become unconscious. And would lose their memory of what happened. You could wipe out a whole army without killing anybody.
That's right.
You could cause civilians to go into this altered state of consciousness.
I found it maybe a little odd that this being such a seminal case, and at some point later on, it became publicly known that there didn't seem to be that much interest beyond the Project Blue Book report from the military, or was there some, you know, behind the scenes interest from them? Because we've read other cases where somebody had reported something and then suddenly they're interrogated for hours and hours and they seem to be followed and they check up on them. There's visits, as you know, from Men in Black that in this case, and also because of Betty and Barney's, and especially Betty's connection to military people and her close associations and friendships for many years, and with people from Pease Air Force Base, was there much more interest from them? It seems, like I said, them being willing to accept reports, but also not really kind of following up on this as maybe one would expect.
Betty and Barney received a lot of support from military officers quietly. Betty told me that they told her that they would work with her as long as she did not join a UFO organization. And they did. There were high-ranking officers who were very supportive of Betty. They knew that this was possible. They believed that this had happened. But down at Wright-Patterson at Project Blue Book, they were scoffing at it. In 1953, the CIA-funded Robertson panel decided that they would debunk UFOs and they would embarrass the people who report them. And that has been their modus operandi pretty much ever since. They've let up in recent years, but they've started up again. So Betty had a lot of support from military officers. What I did find out about with Wright-Patterson and the debunking part of it, in 1964, I believe, or was it 65? It might have been 65. John Luttrell, that newspaper reporter, asked for a copy of the Project Blue Book report that Betty and Barney had filed. the intelligence report. And they sent him a typed copy, but it wasn't the real copy. They were distributing false information. He found out they had put the wrong date on it. Instead of 1961, it was 1964 or 5. I believe it was 1965. And in that 1965 altered report, they left out all the information about how the craft had traveled erratically, how it ascended and descended rapidly, and simply said that it was immobile at all times and was probably a planet.
Right.
And it didn't talk about how it had swooped down over their vehicle and the buzzing sounds. Those are in the first reports. I have all the early reports.
You just picture some guy with a buzz cut, and as we were talking about earlier with your mom and the ironing board, with an ashtray full of cigarettes, just rewriting the thing from his head, trying to castrate it, as it were.
Right.
Remove all the details.
Yes. Being as creative as possible, I suppose. Now, when John Luttrell wrote that newspaper article, it went out around the world. I have a copy of it from an Australian newspaper. It's amazing how far it traveled. And when that happened, Betty's and Barney's file was sent to the Pentagon. They wanted it. So there was interest at the Pentagon.
Okay. But we don't know where it goes beyond that.
No, I don't know that. I haven't been able to access any additional information.
Gosh, and I was going to look into this before we got this far into the series, but I did not check with John Greenwald's site with the Black Vault to see. I'm sure he's done some FOIA stuff on this case, I would imagine, but I don't know. Have you ever looked at that, Kathleen? Like, do you know? Are you familiar with the Black Vault?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
I've known John since he was a teenager.
Yeah, right. He's been at it forever, of course.
He does a great job.
Have you and him talked about trying to get any information like that?
I don't believe we have. He might have talked to Stan Friedman about that.
Sure.
Stan was doing a lot of that work when he and I were working together. We collaborated on 3 books and we were friends and kept in touch. He was, of course, in New Brunswick and I was in Florida.
Right.
But long distance contact. As far as I know, what happened to Betty's and Barney's files were that they went to the CIA.
Okay.
Because that was the protocol in that time frame, that anything that could not be explained went to the CIA.
That brings me to another question, coming back a little bit to the evidence, and that, of course, is, I mean, I don't know how you probably can't get away with being on somebody's show and not getting asked about this, but it's going to be the star map. And there's a lot of data around it. We're curious what the updates are. There's the discourse online, which you also mentioned in your afterword about the Hipparcos Tycho catalog, the 1997 update, and that it was basically nullifying it. And then there's folks that said, well, Marjorie Fish agreed that it was no longer right with the new data. But then on the other hand, you and Stanton Friedman had been in touch with an astronomer or an astronomy student maybe that was working anonymously with you and had determined that maybe it was still on track. What's the current state of all of that?
Yes. It was interesting. There are people who really want to debunk Marjorie's work. Now, Stanton was furious when he found out about that. It was a misstatement.
Okay.
Marjorie said that if her work was inaccurate, that she could accept that, but she didn't state that it was inaccurate.
Okay. So it's misrepresentation.
Yes, there were many scientists who vetted Marjorie's work and said that it was accurate. And there were special properties about the stars on the map. All of them were sun-like stars, although only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years are sun-like stars. And all of the stars on Betty's map were sun-like. They were in a plane, which meant moving from point A to point B would be far easier than, as Stanton used to say, raisins in a loaf of raisin bread, where you would have, long distances to travel in one direction or another. And of course, the sun was on that map. And there was an astrophysics student who did research on that and was in contact with Stanton. She wanted Stanton to actually be on the video that she produced about her work on that map. But Stanton went to Terence Dickinson, who was the astronomer who was one of the people who vetted and wrote about Marjorie's work on the star map. And I believe that you have that booklet.
Yes.
The Zeta Reticuli incident. Yes. With this update, the astrophysics student, instead of using 14 models like Marjorie had to build 3-dimensional models with and string beads do all the math to put them in the right location. It's so much easier today because the student, I believe it was around 2,350, something like that, models of our galaxy that she looked at. She was looking for sun-like stars, with exoplanets. And still, she said that Marjorie's map is 86%, or identification of Betty's map is 86% accurate today. And there might be 2 stars that are better choices that we know of today.
Okay. As far as you're concerned, it's still on track for a possibility for the star map that Betty saw on the craft lining up with it.
Yes, it is. And I'm so disappointed that scientists aren't taking a closer look at Zeta Reticuli, of that star system. But I think it's all due to the taboo. I mean, it's a taboo subject.
Right.
And unfortunately, even though it is something that scientists should be examining, they're believing the government disinformants who have lied about it.
Right.
And that's very frustrating for me because I'm all about the science related to all of this.
What do you think the other significant evidence is in the category of verifying what happened to them? Like there's the other discussion, again mentioned in the afterword and I think elsewhere and captured, of multiple eyewitnesses. How many eyewitnesses are there now to seeing something the night that Betty and Barney's encounter happened?
So far, 16.
16.
Yes. John Luttrell wrote a letter to Stanton Friedman in the 1970s. This is after he left the newspaper. He was working at a hospital at that point as an administrator. And he stated that he had been contacted by 12 to 14 individuals who had observed the craft that night. And he knew that it was the same craft that Betty and Barney were observing because he drew lines from where they were standing. They were in different locations, not in a group together. And all of those lines intersected with where Betty and Barney and the craft were.
Has that chart anywhere? Is that somewhere that can be found, or has anyone seen that besides Luttrell?
No. No, and we wanted that.
Yeah.
But when Luttrell left the newspaper, he, I guess, destroyed everything that he had used, all his notes and everything, because he was leaving. He needed to clean everything out.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there were 2 others. There were 2 military men who were stationed at a base in Maine. They were in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And they were out that night, and they saw craft heading in the direction where Betty and Barney were driving.
Right.
One of them called me, and we have a report. The other one is deceased now, but he put his report into the archival collection at the University of New Hampshire. Oh. And then another person was a truck driver. I was visiting Betty one morning, and she was on the telephone with a truck driver who was driving that night and saw the craft as well. And I wanted to speak to him. I wanted his name, his information. I wanted to interview him, and he did not want anyone to know his identity, wow. Because of the ridicule factor.
Sure.
But there's another witness. When I lived in New Hampshire, I went to upstate New Hampshire to lecture and do a PowerPoint presentation on all of this. And there were individuals who would come up to me after and tell me that they might have seen the craft that night. There was one large business owner whose home was near the business, and he believed there were two craft that night because a second one landed in his field, he said.
Oh, so it's like you get these folks that are additional witnesses, and this probably happens a lot in these kinds of cases, I would imagine, who don't want to involve a bunch of outsiders, but nevertheless, they're fixated on it enough to come to your lectures and keep digging on it the rest of their lives, but also lay low at the same time. But then they come up and they're like, yeah, I think I saw this has been bothering me too. This is why I'm here. They're trying to solve it for themselves, but not necessarily get into the scrum of all the people working to figure out what it was.
Yes, that's correct. And I think people trust me because I know what happened to Betty and Barney with that violation of confidentiality. I guarantee that I will not reveal people's identities.
Sure.
And so a lot of people have talked to me over the years.
That's amazing. And that's very cool. And I'm glad you got to say that on our show. So if anybody's listening that is an additional witness that doesn't want to come on our show, and we'll protect you too, but if you don't, definitely reach out to Kathleen Marden. Your website is Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com, right?
That's correct.
The best way for people to reach you. So let's talk a little bit about another thing that you mentioned in your afterword. You mentioned that you had, maybe when the book was originally written, a previous bias against interdimensional components to their experience, and you've now changed your perspective on that. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, when I started out investigating, I was strictly a nuts and bolts researcher. I was thinking of the technology that we have. I was thinking in terms of how they could get here using the technology that we have, that sort of thing. And over time, I started to talk with PhD physicists who talked to me about how it could be possible for people to be taken through solid surfaces. And that was something that was very perplexing to me because so many experiencers, they might have been taken from an external environment. They were driving or hunting or hiking or whatever initially. But then after that, periodically, they would be taken from their bedrooms at night. Now, a lot of people think that they're just having hypnopompic dreams or sleep paralysis or something similar. It was something we studied, questions we asked in one of the studies that I've worked on. I've worked on 3 major studies, 2 of those with PhD scientists. And what we discovered was that, yes, many of them had the symptoms of sleep paralysis, but among the group of individuals who were authenticated abductees, they had UFO abduction syndrome, lots of evidence, all of that. That group of individuals had clear conscious memory of observing non-humans. First, a light would come in. Then they would see non-humans step out of that. And then they would become paralyzed and able to move only their eyes. So that was more than 50% for the UFO abduction syndrome group. So I talked to some physicists about how this could be possible, and they said, absolutely, it can be possible. In fact, we've already done it using tiny, tiny particles at the CERN.
Right.
But they reminded me that an atom is 99.9% empty space.
Right.
And that all you have to do is align the frequency and the phase. And then atoms can interpenetrate. Matter can interpenetrate. And so it is scientifically possible for people to be taken into this beam of light, whatever it is. I know it looks like light, but it has other properties because it takes an individual up to the craft. and through a solid surface. I found too that the ETs prefer to do it through a closed window as opposed to through a roof or through a solid wall. I think it's just easier for them to do it that way. And if their equipment fails, people might be cut, but they won't end up with fractured cervical spine. I interviewed one experiencer who their equipment did fail, and he was stuck in his ceiling, and it did fracture his cervical spine, and it was a disabling fracture for him.
Oh my!
He had been an engineer and ended up not being able to work any longer, disabled.
We make that point quite a bit, that they're not perfect, and people would say that's also. I find curious that people who are trying to dismiss all of it would say, well, why would there be a crash? If they're smart enough to get here from another planet, how do they crash in the first place? Well, they're not perfect. Their technology does fail.
Murphy's Law affects them as well.
Well, as we know, when people remember stuff, their aim was for you to not remember anything. So you're not talking about it or having a trauma or bringing attention to whatever their goals are and their methods. Yes. And that doesn't always work. So again, it seems like kind of a flawed argument here, but you talk about some type of paranormal contagion that was experienced by some members. We talked a little bit about that happening, and you do mention some strange things in the book that happened to Betty, especially afterwards. Has anything happened to you during that time and during your research, and does it continue?
It did. And let me just preface this a little bit by saying that the book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon was about the government's, the military's UFO program, the recent programs. And there were scientists who went to the Skinwalker Ranch, for example, to explore the paranormal phenomena there, and then went home, and they had these hitchhikers is what they called them, sort of attachments, and they would spread to family members. And that did happen to us when Betty was calling craft into land. And there were two that actually landed on my grandparents' farm at different times. One I'm thinking of where I'm well aware of paranormal phenomena in my childhood home, left physical trace evidence on the ground. There were two individuals who observed it, saw it coming in. And after that happened, we started having orbs, like orbs inside the house that appeared to have intelligence. Mm-hmm. And some poltergeist activity. I had, funny story, but I had a boyfriend in college, and my parents had a cabin cruiser, and we would go out on the Atlantic Ocean and go fishing over the weekend. So they invited my boyfriend to come to the house and spend the night. My brother was off in the Army at the time. It was during the Vietnam War. And so we stayed in my brother's room, and everyone went to bed. We're sleeping soundly when suddenly we hear a huge commotion. He is yelling. What has happened is coat hangers lifted out of my brother's closet, flew across the room, and landed on top of his body. And talk about poltergeist activity. It scared the living daylights out of him. He didn't even want to come back into the house. And he almost broke up with me the next afternoon.
It's like, I really like you, but
that's a little bit much.
Oh my gosh.
Does it continue to this day? Do you find odd little things happening because of your research and continued involvement?
I haven't seen an orb in a few years, but I think the last one is in 2018 or 19 in my home. And it made my body tingle all over. It communicated with me. And you just have to get over the initial fear of that, because, it really gave me the willies when, as I worked deeper and deeper into this field, things started to happen to me and others.
That's the scary part about that too, because, in not this January, but last January, Colin Kelleher and George Knapp came on to talk about Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And one of the things they mentioned, and, that we remember from the book, was the person who the orb passed through them, and they had health problems related to that. So it's like if you get past the fear of being in the presence of an orb and that sort of thing, I feel like if I was in that scenario, I would be like, just please don't go through me.
Yes. I wouldn't want that to happen. I wouldn't want to have health problems, but this wasn't the blue orbs.
Okay.
Maybe there's a different type of orb that attacks military scientists.
Sure.
and not nice people from the public who are just curious about all of this and research it and investigate it, that sort of thing. Because I always project love in their direction.
Right.
If something comes in and I feel that tingling in my body and something starts to communicate with me, I just project love. And it really gives me a feeling of exhilaration. It's, almost like I think I wonder if that's what people described as the Holy Spirit a long, long time ago. Or maybe it is the Holy Spirit. I don't know.
Maybe it is.
Well, when you mention summoning, contact, and interaction, what is your connection or views with projects and organizations like ESETI or the CE5 phenomenon and the people involved and what they're doing with that? Because you do talk a little bit about the interest now of consciousness studies, and that comes up all the time now as Scott and I get further along the road in talking about the paranormal, that there is some kind of established connection that is through consciousness and maybe psychic, even if you don't believe it, so many accounts have, as I think Barney said, mind speaking or talking with your mind. And so there is a consciousness connection there. But as far as modern day or more recent projects like the ESETI Ranch and CE5 communications, what are your views on that?
Well, Betty might have been the first CE5 experimenter. They called it psychophysics experiments back in 1965, 66, 67, when she was working with a group of scientists to try to call in craft. So what I have to say about that is, if you do this, make sure that you're with someone who does this routinely, because there are negative interdimensionals, and if you want something to happen badly enough, they'd be happy to accommodate you, and it would not be a good experience for you. I've had to work with people who have had that happen. And so learn how to protect yourself, work with a person who's highly knowledgeable. I'm aware that some individuals are able to call in craft, able to observe entities on craft, to communicate telepathically. I'm aware of one individual who actually had a craft land, and the entities exited the craft and walked around the humans.
Well, that is, again, we're back to that connection with that. What you just said there is finding somebody who's knowledgeable if you're going to experiment with this. Same thing can be said with ghost hunting and trying to communicate with the departed and various spirits, that you should know what you're doing, because you can invite a negative experience without knowing it. And there is that spiritual connection, and that can be connected to interdimensionality. And so do you think that there is a very strong connection to spirits, ghosts, other phenomenon like that with the alien and ET experience?
I'm not certain about that. I was thinking I was going to give you some information based upon our studies that we've done. We have discovered that the vast majority of experiencers of ET contact become more spiritual, more psychic or intuitive. Some become healers. They can lay their hands on people and heal them. They view their presence on Earth very differently than most humans do, who have not had these experiences. They're very kind, caring people who are very concerned about the environment, about our use of nuclear weapons, and that sort of thing. Now, in terms of ghosts, boy, I know that it is possible to have deceased individuals walking in your home and to see their sort of shadow. They're translucent, but you can see them. People who are experiencers do have this happen. And some experiencers even meet their deceased relatives or even family pets on craft.
Right.
And so that's, I don't have the answers for that.
Well, that's the thing. There seems to be some overlap, and it makes you wonder, is everything just being misrepresented? Are we completely confused about what we're experiencing?
And that's true. Are they really extraterrestrials? Are they all interdimensional? Are they coming here from another planet? Are they interdimensionals from another planet, or interdimensionals that are not far away from us? Are they both? I mean, there are so many questions that I don't have answers for. And that's why I continue to do my research and investigation.
Okay, well, I was expecting answers. I'm disappointed.
Sorry about that.
No one has the answers. We keep asking people. We don't have them either. We just, as Forrest is fond of saying, we always, whenever we finish a topic, we always just have more questions.
Well, better questions, perhaps, as we go
better
along.
ones, yes,
yeah,
better.
You get a little more knowledgeable about how to approach it and how to think about it. And again, without any answers. But even that helps, because otherwise the option is to not think about any of this and just be victim to the weirdness of it. And I think that's what I got from Betty, her life as well, in this experience, is that it really opened her up, and there was a positive benefit from a very traumatic and horrifying experience on many levels. But even when it was happening, there was some humor with it. Scott and I were talking about it, her having a very good sense of humor, and her chuckling at their confusion over what dentures were.
Yeah.
Or just like having a little bit of rapport with them. So it was terrifying, but also it's a grab bag, a mixed bag of experiences. Her communicating, and as with the star map, or wanting to take a book off the ship. And
can you imagine like being a wildlife scientist and you capture a bear and you're tagging its ear and it starts joking around with you? It's like, come here often? No, I don't know. It's like, that's an interesting idea, because Barney, his fear seems so real, so palpable about like just this, I'm going to get you, you're about to get got, as my kid and I will joke about before a tickle attack. But like, he's out there. It's like this thing is looking at him and it's got this focus, and he just knew that something was going to happen. We're going to let you go here. There was one other thing I wanted to ask you about, and that was the newer studies into the symbols that she saw in the book. I think that you had some results on people who were doing some research on that.
Yes, Dr. Don C. Donderi from McGill University. He's now a retired professor. Dr. Stuart Appel from the State University of New York at Brockport. And they used Bud Hopkins symbols that he had experiencers draw in hypnosis. And they photocopied them all onto the same paper, so everything looked alike. They did two separate studies. In the first study, Dr. Appel hypnotized students and gave them the suggestion that they had been on craft and they had observed symbols. And there was also a control group. And then they sketched these symbols, and then the scientists compared the symbols. Well, actually, they had the students do it. Dr. Donderi developed a statistical scale. So he had software, so the students could use it to compare these symbols. And at the end of both of these studies, they discovered that the symbols that Bud Hopkins had been collecting since the mid-1970s were so much alike among the experiencer group, and so different from the students, experimental students, and from the control groups, that UFO abduction might be real. And then he compared Betty's symbols to those that they had collected, and they were nearly identical.
Which also suggests common ground between the beings that are visiting us, right?
Well, there were two different types of symbols.
Right.
Probably from two different groups.
Okay.
But yes, the Greys seem to have their own set of symbols.
Uh-huh.
And I've recently spoken with somebody who has had a very close relationship with ETs throughout her lifetime. And she actually interpreted the symbols for me and said that it was their flight route, what they were to do to land and level off and all of, that sort of thing.
Oh, it's like a mission. A mission.
Yes.
Okay. Since you're a researcher in this field and you don't often get one-on-one time with somebody who looks at a lot of this stuff, what do you think about the idea that the grays or some of these things that people are encountering, that's not their skin, it's a suit to protect them, to protect the being, that whatever you're seeing is actually some kind of spacesuit in a way, to make them safe on Earth?
Well, that would make sense. That would make a lot of sense. And initially, Betty and Barney wondered if it was some kind of a spacesuit that covered their skin. They had the black uniform, but still over their mouth, there seemed to be a membrane.
Mm-hmm.
And the original artist, David Baker, who did the forensic sketches while Barney was in hypnosis, suggested that perhaps it was a protective covering for those entities.
I just want to stop here and say thank you so much for spending so much of your evening with us tonight. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk to us and our listeners. We know they're going to love hearing from you, and also sharing images and audio with us for everyone to check out. You've written what now? 8 books?
8.
More? 8 books.
Yes.
Where can people find your books and/or come see you speak?
You can purchase autograph copies on my website at Kathleen-Marden. They're also available on Amazon in all different formats, and most of them are available at Barnes & Noble as well, and other online bookstores.
Okay, great. And on your website as well, it might indicate places that you can be found speaking or giving lectures.
Yes. Well,
okay.
I have to tell you that I had post-COVID syndrome and I'm just recovering.
Oh my goodness.
And so I had one speaking engagement this year, and it was this past weekend, where I just worked with experiencers. But I will be speaking next year. I'll be putting that on, but I'm not going to do any conferences this year because I'm afraid of a relapse.
Certainly don't blame you. Well, Thank you again for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it was such a joy. I loved it. Thank you.
Oh, great. And if there's any future developments, anything you think we should know about, please let us know. And if anyone reaches out to us trying to get in touch with you, we will obviously put them in touch with you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, let's wrap up with our final thoughts.
Yes.
This is one of the more surprising cases for me. Of course, all abduction experiences are pretty wild just by their nature of what happens to you. But this turned out to be much more than I initially thought, in that I knew a lot about, the circumstances of them being picked up. But having read the book now and diving deep into that and all the details, what's fascinating to me is more so about memory, recall, the subconscious, and our perception of reality, and what is more real now that something has passed. Are your subconscious memories of it, your dreams, more real than the conscious things you remember because they're much more detailed and vivid, and you remember them, as I pointed out earlier, you remember them just as they had happened to you. It's not so much like a dream. It's a memory of something that happened. You just may have not been awake to experience it.
Yes.
Or you were awake and you don't remember that part of it, but it's burned into your subconscious so deeply that it's as if it happened, unlike a dream.
Right.
So what I find fascinating is how it relates to consciousness and the mind and memory, as much as it does aliens and hardware and exams and craft. That, of course, all interests me too, but this is more about how you react and how you remember them and what it does to you as a person for years and years and how it affects the rest of your life. So we have that story as well. And in this case, we also have hypnotic regression. And yes, it has its faults, but I think it's also useful not only as therapy, but to glean some details that, well, you'll never know if they're true or not, but to the person, you'll have to judge that for yourself once you hear what you said under hypnosis. Like, that fits, that tracks.
I agree with you more, and it's something that keeps coming up, and it came up even with Kathleen. It's like the nuts and bolts, and do we think about the interdimensional quality of that? And the interdimensional term, I think, is already being applied to a broader sense than just literally interdimensional. It's more like dimensions of our reality, not necessarily in the scientific definition, but in the idea that things that we just can't perceive yet, not necessarily for mathematical reasons, but for other reasons, that there's something that's preventing us from taking something in. And one of the messages that was given to Betty at some point, I believe, or Barney, I can't remember who, but it was just like, no one's going to believe you because your memories are going to be different from each other. And so what that's saying is like, we, the abductors, control how you perceive things, not you. We might not be able to erase your memories completely, but we can manipulate how you remember them. So if they're saying that Barney's memories can be different from Betty's, does that imply they can make them different, but in an imprecise way? Is this chaos, like scrambling an egg in a bowl? We can all scramble an egg, but we can't pick how the scrambled egg is going to look in the bowl once it's scrambled.
Or cooked,
right?
Yeah, afterwards. But let me ask you this, though. In extrapolating from that, okay, so perhaps they have a method, technology, to make you remember things a certain way, or is it that's kind of half-arsed where they can make you remember something as a screen memory, but it doesn't fully cover everything, and then your brain does the rest. Your brain is trying to mop up this mess of an experience, and that's what happens. It's trying to make sense of things,
which is what the human brain does. That's a really good point.
Right.
It's always trying to make sense of the thing. It's always trying to see the face in the cloud, the pareidolia, the whatever. It's doing that on every level beyond pareidolia. It's the need for cognitive closure, the attempt to understand what we're looking at and to describe it in the only terms we have that are familiar to us, even if it's something that we can't quite get.
Right.
What happens when you get exposed to that kind of technology, whether it's a map on a craft while you're being abducted, and how do you describe it? Oh, well, it reminded me of a map in high school that you would pull down.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like, I don't know what a computer screen looks like or a touch screen. You know, I can't, how are you going to describe a Minority Report interface if you are living in the late 50s and the early 60s? So, and then there's the other thing is like, are you seeing these nuts and bolts crafts because that's what you expect to see? And like with regard to fears and Barney's descriptions, a lot of people suggest that his descriptions are, you know, him being part of a biracial couple or his civil rights work for the NAACP. He was an exceptionally courageous man, but he was realistic about the state of civil rights for himself and Betty in 1961. On this craft, his memories under hypnosis are part of his worst fears of having his personal rights taken away from him, being controlled and physically assaulted. And, you know, and so people are saying, well, that's all it is. He's just, you know, it's just repressed fears. And I mean, I think we all have repressed fears of having all our rights taken away from us. None of us want to be down in the well in Silence of the Lambs, right? That's why it's a scary movie. But that doesn't mean if we go through a traumatic event and you ask us what happened, that we're all going to say we were in the well or have that specificity to it.
Okay, but here's the thing. Let's take all the evidence together in that, all right, if it was just Barney by himself and alone, and no other evidence he could put forth, physical, then, okay, maybe. Like he had a traumatic experience, maybe something, you know, you have a psychotic break, a fugue state, and then that's what you remember. It's like, well, it wasn't a bunch of thugs. It was aliens that threatened me or beat me up or, you know, humiliated me. Something horrible happened, and so you fill that in with aliens, I guess, mixed with extreme tiredness. But that would require a bit of a mental health issue, in my opinion. In this case, what about Betty's experience combined with this? So they both experienced something and had their own layers. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not conducive to both of them having done this, gone through this. And if you take the evidence as being accurate, then the little bits of physical evidence left behind, what accounts for that? Right.
But then you know, these folks are saying, well, it's her dreams influenced his memories and that's where it all came from. And I just don't get it. I get some folks saying, there's people that say, and this seems to happen a lot with these kind of stories, there's people like, well, it was a light on the mountain. And when I went up there and drove around and the light came into view and it went out of view.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, let's say that that's true. How do you explain the genital warts or the items that were similar to that? What does that have to do with driving and seeing a light on the mountain? Now, granted, those showed up 4 months later, by the way, after the event. So it's like, oh no, something happened. Or how do you explain the scuffed shoes? Well, we didn't see those. How do we
how you explain that?
The spinning compass. Oh, I didn't see that.
That didn't happen.
How do you explain, though, in this case, and it's thanks to a lot of the work that Kathleen has done, how do you explain the rare earth elements found on the dress. That is scientifically a fact that those are on that dress. Right. How did they get there? How do you explain the yeast-like substance? I mean, you could say, oh, well, yeah, of course, Betty's own DNA is on the inside of the dress. It's her dress. Right. But there's a lot of things that you have to kind of throw out to make one thing work. Right. There's nothing that explains all of it. And that's the way it always is with folks who are like, well, I don't know about this. But when you take the totality of everything, yeah, sure. Are there inaccuracies in it? Of course, there's going to be inaccuracies in the memories, whether from the dreams or from the hypnosis or even the conscious memories. We all know that those aren't super reliable either. But when you take it all together and you take the physical evidence that they supposedly had and you take the amazing people that this couple was before all this happened, in a lot of ways, this ruined Barney's life. And he died 8 years later. He passed away from a hemorrhage. And it's a lot to do with the stress. And as you heard Kathleen say, his reputation was everything to him. He was doing such great work in the civil rights movement. That was all gone. Now he was the guy that got, kidnapped and probed, and he wound up dying. And she lived a long time after that, but she wound up moving. And there's chapters in Stanton Friedman and Kathleen's book about this. She wound up becoming overly involved into what you said earlier, going out all the time and trying to see UFOs all the time. But that's, to me too, for somebody who's had such a profound experience and based on a lot of the things that we've covered in the past, that's also a natural progression for an experiencer. It's like, how can I get back to what that was so I can understand it better? Because you're not getting that cognitive closure. You haven't been allowed to get it. They came and asked you a bunch of questions and then they left and your cheese is out in the wind. Understanding it, but also having power over the experience, right? And that you now control it. You're not going to be a victim of this and cower in the corner and be afraid to go out at night. No, you're going to go to conferences. You're going to go out and take control of this and not be afraid of it. Get to the bottom of it. Yeah, like I said, just lean into it, as they say nowadays. As far as memories and the technology of implanting that, and also everything is just a little bit sloppy and half measured. You know what I'm saying? And that, when I said this before, it's like they can kind of make you forget stuff, but it doesn't work totally. Sometimes they do crash. They're not perfect beings. They have high technology, but sometimes it screws up. Some of the tests might hurt. Well, here's the point. We're not going to do you any harm. Well, they're not really considering the psychological damage to your livelihood. The catch and release trout, you're going to go swim back in the stream, and you're not going to think about any of this anymore. You'll be fine. We did no harm here, and we got the DNA we wanted. But that's not the case. And so they don't really understand us. It's like understanding the false teeth. Like, how do these work? Why would you have fake teeth? Are all humans born without teeth? And then these are just made? And they didn't understand colors or vegetables or old age. These, again, if that's all accurate and not just, part of Betty's imagination or subconscious imagination, then they don't understand some very simple concepts as we do. But they're not things we have not heard before from the abduction experience, about simple things. I think going back again to Pascagoula, one of them claiming that the alien lady stuck her finger up his nose until it started bleeding. Like, do you not know what the nose is for? Right. And so anyway, I know this is your conclusions and I've hijacked this, but I just wanted to say that, in this aspect of it, you're talking about the memory part of it. I think it's like, here's a few memories of some wacky stuff that happened. Good luck, kids, you crazy kids. Get on your way. And that's not nearly enough, and it doesn't work. I think they wrap up their abductions as good as they're going to get it, as much as they care or understand. And the rest of it, as they say, good enough for government work. I think all of this is part of a much bigger paranormal picture. I think that there are stronger connections, even though Kathleen seemed unsure of it. I do feel that there are stronger connections between the ghosts and the spirituality and the paranormal events and the idea that all of these things are one great big happening of some kind. And I think this inability to decipher what happens in these encounters based on recalled evidence is working exactly like it's supposed to for the perpetrators. As I said in this series, Barney saw fins on the aircraft with red lights, a lot like, as I suggested, the back of Betty's 57 Chevy Bel Air. However, I need to make a correction. Her car was blue and white. It was not red. I just assumed it was red because most of them were, or it seemed like they all were. Hers was blue and white, so maybe that doesn't hold water. Woodrow Derenberger from the Mothman Indrid Cold case saw a lantern-shaped craft with a squeaky door. I think those are screen memories, as we talked about, for whatever's really happening. What's really there, you don't really know. And the freaky thing is, these happen across the board, whether it's the little girls from one of Terry Lovelace's readers who saw a merry-go-round calliope-looking craft that they approached, to Sam the Sandown Clown's appearance, to Woody's lantern, to Betty and Barney's disc with fins, all part of this trickster component, which I can't believe we haven't covered that book yet, The Trickster and the Paranormal. It begs the question, are all these things actually coming from the same source? And they're just appearing to us in different ways to keep us all guessing and, more importantly, disbelieving each other about the true nature of what's going on. That's going to wrap up episode 288 of Astonishing Legends, concluding this special series on Betty and Barney Hill's abduction. A very special thanks to Kathleen Marden for joining us tonight. Also, a special thanks to Jim Harold again for connecting us with Kathleen. Look for links to her books and appearances in our show notes. We're still on our summer schedule, so we have a 3-week break right now. We'll have another 2 shows in a row after that, with the first one dropping on August 17th. We're working on a secret project in our downtime, so please bear with us.
Find and subscribe to the other shows from the Astonishing Legends Network, The Midnight Library, Scared All the Time, and Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf. We have links to all of them in our show notes. Our show is edited by Sarah Voorhees-Wendell at VW Sound and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also head of research and the social media manager. Our technical producer is Ed Vocola, or as we call him, the Mechanic. Special thanks to our announcer, John Bolin.
This is Ben James.
Hi, I'm Todd Sturgill.
Hi, I'm Jazz. Galaxy-wide in perpetuity.
Galaxy-wide in perpetuity.
My name is spelled B-E-N.
Present of future compensation.
J-A-M-E-S.
T-O-E-D.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane at foundermusic.com. All other music and sound design for the show is composed and created by Alan Carestia.
Our logo was created by Tommy Beaver Design, and our animated graphics for social media and YouTube are done by Joshua Sloan at deadstreetproductions.com.
Many episodes have transcripts available. For ones that don't, you can request them by emailing transcripts at astonishinglegends.com.
Astonishing Legends would not be possible without you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Instagram, Twitter, Discord, Facebook, and YouTube.
You can also visit us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to commercial-free versions of the show and additional bonus content, including the Patreon-exclusive show, The Astonishing Junk Drawer. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.